Hey guys, imagine this. A Scottish hero, larger than life, fighting for freedom, only to meet an end so gruesomely twisted that even Braveheart's Hollywood gloss couldn't stomach the full truth. We're talking dragged naked through streets, hanged till choking, then sliced open while still breathing. Guts yanked out and burned before your eyes. Yeah, William Wallace's execution wasn't a quick chop. It was a medieval horror show designed to break a nation. Buckle up, because what really happened in 1305 makes your worst nightmare look like a spa day. Before you get comfortable, please hit like and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy what I do. Drop a comment telling me where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's dive together into today's journey. Ah, the Middle Ages. That golden era where survival meant dodging plague rats, feudal lords with bad tempers, and the occasional dragon myth to spice up your peasant porridge. But for William Wallace, it wasn't just about surviving. It was about thrusting a claymore into the face of English oppression and yelling, "Freedom!" at the top of his lungs. Or at least, that's the romanticized version we all love from movies. In reality, it was a blood-soaked farce of betrayal, brutality, and enough historical absurdity to make you wonder why anyone bothered waking up in the 13th century. Picture this: Scotland, late 1200s. The country's in chaos because their king, Alexander III, decided to play extreme sports on horseback one stormy night in 1286. He rides off a cliff, splat, leaving no direct heir. Cue the power vacuum, where every noble with a kilt and a grudge starts scheming. Enter Edward I of England, that lanky tyrant nicknamed Longshanks, because, well, he had legs like stilts and a heart like a frozen haggis. Edward sees Scotland as his personal playground and appoints himself overlord. The Scots? Not thrilled. They form alliances, bicker among themselves, and basically set the stage for a rebellion that would make modern politics look like a tea party. Now, Wallace wasn't born into this mess as some predestined hero. No, he was just a guy, tall, burly, probably with a beard that could hide a family of squirrels, from Elderslie, near Paisley. Historians argue about his exact origins. Was he a minor noble? A commoner with ambition? Who knows? Back then, records were kept on sheepskin by monks who were more interested in illuminating manuscripts than fact-checking. But one thing's clear: by 1297, Wallace had had enough. The English sheriff of Lanark, William Hazelrig, allegedly killed Wallace's wife or lover. Stories vary, but let's go with the dramatic one, because history loves a good revenge plot. Wallace storms in, slaughters the sheriff, and suddenly he's public enemy number one. Absurd, right? One personal vendetta spirals into a national uprising. Imagine avenging your partner by accidentally kickstarting a war. Talk about overkill. Wallace teams up with Andrew Moray, another rebel with a cause, and they rally the Scots. These weren't professional soldiers. They were farmers, blacksmiths, and guys who'd rather be tending sheep than skewering English knights. But, oh, the irony. The English army was this bloated beast of heavy cavalry and archers, funded by taxes squeezed from peasants who could barely afford bread. Edward's forces marched north like they owned the place, which they kind of did on paper. But Wallace? He plays dirty. Guerrilla tactics, ambushes, and misty glens where the fog hides your screams. It's survival horror. English patrols vanishing into the highlands, only bones found later. The pain of living, then? Constant hunger, wounds festering without antibiotics, and the ever-present fear that your lord might switch sides for a shiny title. The big moment comes at the Battle of Stirling Bridge in September 1297. Picture the absurdity. The English, under John de Warenne, Earl of Surrey, have this massive army crossing a narrow wooden bridge over the River Forth. Wallace and Moray wait like patient predators. Why rush? Let the enemy bottleneck themselves. As half the English force crosses, the Scots charge. Chaos ensues, knights tumbling into the water in their heavy armor, drowning like ironclad anchors. The bridge collapses under the weight of panic. Hugh de Cressingham, the English treasurer, a fat, greedy bureaucrat hated by everyone, gets flayed alive post-battle, his skin turned into a sword belt for Wallace. Savage? Absolutely. But in those days, it was messaging. Don't mess with Scotland, or we'll wear you as accessories. The victory sends shockwaves. Wallace is knighted, becomes guardian of Scotland. For a brief, glorious moment, freedom tastes like whiskey and victory haggis. But history's a cruel jester. Moray dies from wounds, leaving Wallace solo. Edward I, furious at the humiliation, musters an even bigger army, 14,000 infantry, 2,500 cavalry, and invades personally in 1298. Wallace, ever the survivor, avoids direct confrontation, scorching the earth to starve the invaders. Smart, but the Scots nobles? They're busy in fighting, jealous of this upstart commoner leading them. Betrayal brews like bad ale. At Falkirk, July 1298, Wallace's forces are arrayed in schiltrons, tight circles of spearmen like human porcupines. It works against cavalry, but English longbowmen rain arrows like lethal confetti. The Scots cavalry flees, thanks nobles, and Wallace's men are slaughtered. He escapes, but his aura shatters. Resigns as guardian, goes underground. The pain? Watching your dream crumble because your allies are more interested in land grabs than liberty. For years, Wallace dodges capture, raiding English garrisons, becoming a ghost in the heather. Edward offers bounties, but Scots' loyalty holds, mostly, until 1305. Sir John de Menteith, a Scottish knight who'd switched sides, because why not? Survival meant picking the winning team, betrays him. Wallace is ambushed near Glasgow, captured while sleeping. Irony alert, the man who fought for Scottish independence is sold out by a fellow Scot for 300 marks in some land. Ouch. Dragged to London in chains, Wallace faces a show trial at Westminster Hall on August 23, 1305. No defense allowed. He's gagged, literally crowned with laurel as a mocking king of outlaws. The charges: treason, homicide, robbery, the works. Wallace's response: I could not be a traitor to Edward, for I was never his subject. Boom. Mic drop. But Edward's not amused. Sentence: hanged, drawn, and quartered. The ultimate medieval deterrent reserved for traitors. It's not just death, it's a spectacle of suffering, designed to terrify onlookers into submission. Now, let's slow down and savor the horror, because this is where the real nightmare begins. Dragged from Westminster to Smithfield, about 4 miles, naked, tied to a horse's tail. Bumped over cobblestones, pelted with rotten veggies, jeered by crowds who days ago might have cheered a different hero. Absurd, isn't it? One man's freedom fighter is another's terrorist, depending on who's writing the chronicle. At Smithfield, the execution site reeks of blood and fear. A marketplace turned slaughterhouse. Wallace is hoisted up, noosed, and hanged, but not to death. Oh no, that'd be merciful. They let him dangle till he's blue, choking, legs kicking in agony, then cut him down alive. The pain? Imagine your neck stretched, windpipe crushed, but consciousness clinging like a bad hangover. Survival in the past meant enduring what we'd call torture porn. Next, the drawing, evisceration while breathing. They slice open his abdomen, yank out intestines, burn them before his eyes. Legend says Wallace watched his own guts sizzle, maybe even quipped something defiant. Historical absurdity. This was justice, a ritual to purge treason from the body. Then emasculation, genitals hacked off, because why not add humiliation? Beheading follows, blood spurting like a fountain. Finally, quartering, body chopped into 4, dipped in tar for preservation. Head spiked on London Bridge as a grisly trophy. Limbs sent to Newcastle, Berwick, Stirling, Perth, warnings to Scotland, rebel, and end up as decor. But wait, that's just the execution cliff notes. To truly grasp the horror, we need to backtrack to Wallace's early days, the roots of his rage. Born around 1270 in a Scotland simmering under English influence. His father, Malcolm Wallace, a minor landowner, probably instilled that fierce pride. Education? Likely from monks, learning Latin, strategy, maybe even dreaming of chivalry. But life was brutal. Famines, raids, the constant threat of border rivers stealing your cattle. Survival? It was eating oatmeal that tasted like dirt, sleeping in damp huts and praying. The Black Death didn't visit early, though that came later. Wallace grows into a giant, over 6 feet in an era when 5 foot something was average. Legends paint him as superhuman, wielding a sword longer than most men. Absurd hyperbole, but hey, History needs its myths to mask the pain. By 1296, Edward invades full force after the Scots ally with France. The old alliance, that thorn in England's side. Berwick sacked, 10,000 civilians massacred in a bloodbath that makes Game of Thrones look tame. Women raped, children butchered, Edward's Hammer of the Scots earning his nickname. Wallace, witnessing this, it fuels the fire. His first kills, English soldiers harassing locals. Guerrilla warfare ensues, hitting supply lines, burning castles. The absurdity, a ragtag band challenging an empire. Pain, friends dying from arrow wounds, gangrene setting in without mercy. Post-Stirling, Wallace invades northern England, payback time. Raids Cumberland, Northumberland, teat for tat terror. Churches looted, but Wallace spares clergy, showing that chivalric streak. Irony, the outlaw has more honor than kings, but Edward's relentless. After Falkirk, Wallace flees to France, seeking aid from Philip IV. Sea voyages back then. Storms, scurvy, pirates, survival at sea was a gamble. He returns empty-handed, resumes hit-and-run tactics. The betrayal by Menteith, a knife in the back from kin. Captured August 5th, 1305 at Robroyston. Dragged south in irons, 700 miles of jolting misery. Arrival in London, paraded like a trophy. Crowds mock, but some whisper admiration. Trial, a farce. Edward's judges read charges. Wallace denies treason since he never swore fealty. Sentenced anyway. The execution morning, August 23rd, hot summer day. Stripped naked, humiliation first. Dragged through streets, skin scraping raw. At the gallows, perhaps a final speech, but records say he prayed. Hanged, asphyxiation agony, vision blurring. Cut down, tied to a table. Knife plunges, belly open, steam rising from innards. Heart removed last, still beating. Myth, but poetic. Beheaded, body hacked, parts displayed, a message in flesh. Yet, Wallace's death backfires, inspires Robert the Bruce, leads to Bannockburn in 1314. Freedom won, sorta. Absurd cycle. One man's torment sparks a nation's rise. Pain of the past? It echoes in every rebellion since. Folks, if this tale of medieval madness has you hooked, drop a comment. Would you fight like Wallace or switch sides for survival? What's the most absurd historical fact you've heard? Let's chat while we gear up for part 2. The deeper dive into the execution's gory details and its ripple effects. Stay tuned, the nightmare's just beginning. Alright, let's dive back into the blood-soaked saga of William Wallace's execution. A tale so grim it makes your average horror flick look like a picnic with puppies. If you thought part 1 was a wild ride, buckle up, because we're about to crank the absurdity, pain, and medieval madness up to 11. Picture this, a man who fought for freedom, betrayed by his own, dragged to London like a trophy, and subjected to a death so deliberately cruel it's practically performance art for psychopaths. We're not just talking about a quick exit. This is a meticulously choreographed nightmare meant to break spirits and make crowds gag. So grab your imaginary torch, maybe a bucket for the squeamish, and let's wade deeper into the cesspool of 1305. We left off with Wallace captured, betrayed by Sir John de Menteith, a fellow Scot who decided a bag of English coins was worth more than honor. Classic medieval move. Loyalty was as flexible as a soggy kilt in those days. August 5th, 1305, near Glasgow. Wallace is nabbed while dreaming of haggis or rebellion, probably both. The English waste no time. They chain him up and drag him 700 miles south to London. Imagine the journey, shackled to a cart, bouncing over rutted roads, eating moldy bread if you're lucky, while guards prod you with spears for fun. Survival in the Middle Ages meant enduring this kind of torment without losing your mind or your lunch. The pain? Skin chafing raw, muscles cramping, and the constant dread of what's waiting at journey's end. Absurdity? The fact that half the people cheering your capture would have toasted your name a year earlier. London, August 1305. The city's a stinking sprawl of narrow streets, open sewers, and crowds who turn up for a public execution like it's the Super Bowl. Wallace arrives, gaunt from the road, still towering over his captors, because, let's be real, the man was built like a Highland ox. The English parade him through the streets, a living propaganda piece for Edward I's dominance. They mock him, call him a brigand, a murderer, a traitor. Kids throw stones, merchants spit, but some in the crowd, maybe Scots traitors or secret sympathizers, watch in silence, hearts heavy. The irony? Wallace, the outlaw, has more integrity than the nobles who sold him out. He's not just a man, he's a symbol, and symbols don't die quietly. The trial, if you can call it that, happens on August 23rd at Westminster Hall. Picture a cavernous room, tapestries on the walls, lords in fine robes sneering down from benches. Wallace stands, hands bound, probably gagged with a rag to keep him from rallying the crowd with one of those epic speeches we imagine he gave. The charges are read: treason, murder, arson, robbery, the medieval equivalent of throwing the book at him. Treason's the big one, because Edward I, that lanky sadist, insists Wallace is a subject of England. Wallace's comeback? Pure gold. I could not be a traitor to Edward, for I was never his subject. In one line, he flips the script, denying England's claim over Scotland. The crowd murmurs, the judges scowl. No defense is allowed. Justice in 1305 is just a fancy word for vengeance. The sentence? Hanged, drawn, and quartered. A death so brutal it's less about punishment and more about sending a message. Defy the king, and you'll wish you'd never been born. Now, let's pause to unpack this hanged, drawn, and quartered business, because it's not just a catchy phrase. It's a masterclass in medieval cruelty. This isn't a swift axe to the neck like Anne Boleyn got later. No, this is a drawn-out spectacle, a torture marathon designed to maximize pain and terror. Step 1. Hanging. You're strung up by the neck, but not enough to kill you outright. The executioner lets you dangle, gasping, eyes bulging until you're half dead from asphyxiation. Step 2. Drawing. While you're still alive, they cut you open. Think amateur surgery without anesthesia. Your intestines are pulled out, sometimes burned in front of you. Step 3. Quartering. After you're finally dead, or close enough, they chop your body into pieces. Head goes on a spike. Limbs get mailed to different towns like gruesome postcards. Why? To scare the living daylights out of anyone thinking rebellion is a fun hobby. The absurdity? This was considered a civilized punishment, sanctioned by the church and state. The pain? Beyond imagination, every nerve screaming, every second an eternity. On execution day, August 23rd, 1305, Smithfield's the stage. It's a market area turned killing ground, reeking of blood, sweat, and the charred remains of previous victims. The crowd's massive, thousands packed in, from pickpockets to priests, all eager for the show. Public executions were the reality TV of the Middle Ages, free, gruesome, and weirdly unifying. Wallace is dragged from Westminster, 4 miles of humiliation. Naked, tied to a horse's tail, he's scraped over cobblestones, pelted with garbage, rotten cabbage, fish guts, you name it. The crowd jeers, but some whisper prayers. He's still a hero to a few, even here. At Smithfield, the gallows loom, a wooden frame built for suffering. The executioner, probably some grizzled guy who's seen it all, ties the noose. Wallace, defiant to the end, might have muttered something about Scotland. No record confirms it, but let's imagine he did, because a hero needs a final word, right? The hanging begins. Rope bites into his neck, cutting off air. His face turns purple, veins popping, legs kicking instinctively. The crowd roars, some in glee, some in horror. Minutes pass, he's not dead yet. The executioner cuts him down, still conscious, barely. Now, the real horror, tied to a wooden table, arms and legs spread. The knife flashes, sharp because dull blades are for amateurs. A slash across the abdomen, and blood pours out. Hands reach in, pulling out loops of intestine. Some accounts say they're burned on a brazier right there, the stench of roasting flesh mixing with the crowd's gasps. Wallace, if he's still aware, sees his own insides turn to ash. Pain? It's not just physical, it's the soul-crushing realization that this is how it ends. Absurdity? The executioner's precision, like he's carving a roast for a royal banquet. Then comes emasculation, genitals sliced off, tossed into the fire. Why? To strip away manhood, dignity, everything. The crowd winces, even the bloodthirsty ones feel a twinge. Beheading follows, a mercy at this point. The axe falls and Wallace's head rolls, eyes still open, staring into eternity. Quartering is last, the body hacked into 4 parts, each piece dipped in tar to preserve it for display. The head spiked on London Bridge, a grisly ornament for ships passing below. Limbs go to Newcastle, Berwick, Stirling, Perth. Edward's way of saying, this is what happens to rebels. Irony? This over-the-top brutality only fans the flames of Scottish resistance. Nice job, Longshanks. Let's zoom out. Why this obsession with such a barbaric punishment? Edward I wasn't just killing Wallace, he was killing an idea. Scotland's dream of independence was a thorn in his side, and he thought public torture would snuff it out. Spoiler, it didn't. The Middle Ages were a time when power was raw, unfiltered. Kings ruled by fear, not hashtags. Survival meant navigating a world where your lord could demand your life, your crops, or your daughter on a whim. Pain was currency. Endure it, inflict it, or die from it. Absurdity? The fact that people accepted this as normal, cheering while a man's guts were barbecued. Wallace's execution wasn't just about him. It was a warning to every Scot, every rebel, every dreamer. But here's the kicker. It backfired spectacularly. His death galvanized Scotland. Robert the Bruce, who'd been playing both sides like a medieval politician, takes up the mantle. By 1314, at Bannockburn, he crushes Edward II's army, Longshanks' son, who inherited the throne but not the brains. Scotland's independence, at least for a while, is secured. Wallace's mangled body parts became relics of a cause, not a deterrent. Irony at its finest, Edward's attempt to crush a rebellion created a martyr. But let's not romanticize too much. Wallace wasn't a saint. He burned villages, killed civilians in his raids on northern England. War wasn't clean, it was a meat grinder. The pain of the era, constant. Hunger gnawed at you, disease stalked you, and betrayal was just Tuesday. Survival meant being harder than the world around you. Wallace was, until he wasn't. His capture, trial, and execution were a masterclass in medieval power dynamics. Crush the body, kill the spirit, display the remains. Yet, the spirit lived on. What's the vibe of 1305 London during this? Filthy, loud, chaotic. Streets ankle-deep in mud and worse. Plague's a constant threat. Though the Black Death's a few decades off, lesser diseases still drop you like flies. Food's scarce unless you're rich. Most eat gruel or stale bread. The smell? Sewage, smoke, and unwashed bodies. Executions like Wallace's were a break from the grind, a chance to feel something, even if it's horror. The crowd wasn't all monsters. Some wept, some prayed, some just gawked, because what else was there to do? Back to Wallace's final moments. Did he scream, curse, pray? No one knows for sure. Chroniclers, mostly English, paint him as defiant but silent. Scottish legends say he roared, freedom. Probably wishful thinking, but it's a good story. The executioner's job was grim but steady work. Imagine the guy going home, washing blood off his hands, eating supper like it's just another day. Absurd, right? That's the Middle Ages, life and death tangled in a grotesque dance. This part's done, but the story's not. Next up, we'll dig into the aftermath. How Wallace's death reshaped Scotland, England, and the myth that outlived them both. Drop a comment. What's the most brutal historical punishment you've heard of? Would you have watched Wallace's execution or stayed home? Let's keep the convo going while we prep for Part 3's deep dive into the legacy of this bloody spectacle. Stay tuned because history's about to get even messier. Alright folks, we're back for round 3 of William Wallace's gruesome exit from the medieval stage. A story so drenched in blood, betrayal, and sheer historical lunacy that it's practically a twisted fairy tale for grown-ups. If you thought the execution itself was the peak of this nightmare, think again. The aftermath of Wallace's death in 1305 is where the real chaos unfolds, sparking a legacy that's equal parts heroic myth, grim reality, and absurd political chess. Picture this. A man's body hacked to bits, his head on a spike, yet somehow he becomes the ghost that haunts an empire. So, grab your metaphorical pitchfork, maybe a stiff drink, and let's plunge into the fallout of this medieval horror show. Comment below, What's the wildest historical ripple effect you've ever heard of? Let's keep the vibe alive as we unravel this mess. The execution's done, August 23rd, 1305, Smithfield, London. Wallace's head is grinning from London Bridge, a macabre welcome sign for anyone crossing the Thames. His limbs? Shipped off like grim care packages to Newcastle, Berwick, Stirling, and Perth. Edward I, that lanky sadist with a crown, thinks he's won. Crush the rebel, scatter his parts, scare the Scots into submission. Classic power move from a king nicknamed Hammer of the Scots. But here's the irony so thick you could cut it with a claymore. Wallace's death doesn't end the rebellion, it lights a fuse. Scotland, instead of cowering, gets angrier. It's like Edward took a stick, poked a hornet's nest, then wondered why he's getting stung. Absurd? You bet. The Middle Ages ran on this kind of logic. Kill a man to kill a movement, only to make him a martyr. Pain? It's not just Wallace's suffering. It's the collective ache of a nation watching their hero reduced to a gruesome display. Let's set the scene. Scotland, post-execution, is a mess. The country's been under English boot since Edward's invasions in the 1390s. Nobles are split, some kissing Edward's ring for land and titles, others whispering rebellion over their whiskey. The common folk? They're the ones who feel Wallace's loss deepest. He wasn't some high-born lord, he was one of them, a guy who rose from nothing to stick it to the English. His death hits like a punch to the gut. Survival in 1305, Scotland means scraping by on barley and oats, dodging English tax collectors, and praying your village isn't burned in the next raid. The pain of the era? Constant fear. Fear of starvation, disease, or a knight's sword. The absurdity? People still believed in honor, even as their lord swapped sides like it was a game of medieval musical chairs. Enter Robert the Bruce, the ultimate fence-sitter turned legend. This guy's been playing both teams, swearing loyalty to Edward one day, plotting with rebels the next. After Wallace's execution, Bruce smells opportunity. He's got royal blood, a claim to the Scottish throne, and a knack for timing. In 1306, he makes his move, meeting John Comyn, another claimant, at Greyfriars Kirk in Dumfries. They argue, probably over who gets the crown and who gets to spit on Edward's grave first. Things get heated, blades come out, and Bruce stabs Comyn dead in a church. Sacrilege? Sure. But in the Middle Ages, murder in holy places was just spicy politics. Bruce is excommunicated, but he doesn't care. He crowns himself King of Scots 6 weeks later, March 25th, 1306, at Scone. The absurdity, a king crowned with no army, no money, and half his nobles against him. The pain, knowing one wrong move means ending up like Wallace, gutted and quartered. Bruce's early days as king are a disaster. Edward's forces chase him like hounds after a fox. He's hiding in caves, dodging assassins, his family captured, his wife imprisoned, his sisters caged like animals. A survival? It's Bruce and a handful of loyal men, eating berries and plotting in the highlands. Legend says a spider weaving its web inspires him to keep fighting. Cute story, probably made up by monks who loved a good metaphor. But Wallace's shadow looms large. His death proved one man could rally a nation, and Bruce takes notes. By 1307, he's winning skirmishes, using the same guerrilla tactics Wallace perfected. Hit fast, vanish into the mist. The pain of rebellion, losing friends, family, everything. The absurdity, fighting for a crown while sleeping in ditches. Edward I, meanwhile, is livid. He's 68, old for the time, riddled with dysentery, but still hell-bent on crushing Scotland. He marches north in 1307, dreaming of more heads on spikes. Then, in a twist straight out of a dark comedy, he dies on July 7th at Berg, by Sands, just shy of the border. Poetic, right? The hammer of the Scots croaks before he can swing again. His son, Edward II, takes over, a guy so bad at kinging he makes you miss his dad's ruthless efficiency. Edward II's more interested in his buddy Piers Gaveston than military strategy, and the Scots smell weakness. Bruce ramps up the fight, capturing castles, burning English garrisons. By 1314, he's ready for the big one, Bannockburn, June 23rd to 24th, 1314, near Stirling. The Battle of Bannockburn is where Wallace's legacy cashes in. Bruce, with maybe 6,000 men, faces an English army twice that size. Knights, archers, the works. But Bruce is clever. He picks boggy ground, uses schiltrons, those spiky spear formations Wallace loved, and lures the English into a trap. Day 1. English cavalry charges, gets stuck in mud, skewered like kebabs. Day 2. Bruce's men push forward, and the English, cramped and panicking, collapse. Edward II flees, leaving his army to die. It's a slaughter. Thousands of English dead, Scotland's morale sky high. The irony? Wallace, dead for 9 years, is the spiritual fuel for this win. His execution didn't break Scotland, it forged it. Pain? The cost in blood, Scots and English alike, torn apart for a king's ego. Absurdity? A ragtag army beating Europe's finest because they believed in a dead man's cause. Bannockburn secures Scotland's independence, at least for a bit. The 1328 Treaty of Edinburgh-Northampton makes it official. Scotland's free, Bruce is king. But let's not get too cozy. Freedom's fragile. English kings keep eyeing Scotland like it's a buffet. Wallace's death, though, plants a seed. His story spreads, whispered in taverns, sung by bards. By the 15th century, poets like Blind Harry are spinning epic tales, turning Wallace into a demigod. Historical accuracy? Meh. Harry's The Wallace is more fan fiction than fact, but it fuels Scottish pride for centuries. The pain of the past? It lingers in every Scot who remembers Wallace's name. The absurdity? A man's torture becomes a nation's anthem. What about England? Edward II's reign is a train wreck. After Bannockburn, he's humiliated, his nobles restless. By 1327, he's deposed, murdered, some say, with a red-hot poker in a way too gruesome to detail, but you can Google it. His son, Edward III, takes over, and the cycle of war continues. The 100 Years' War with France kicks off, and Scotland's old alliance with the French keeps the English busy. Wallace's execution, meant to end resistance, instead sets off a domino effect of rebellion, war, and chaos. Irony at its peak, Edward I's ultimate power play makes his dynasty's life harder. Let's talk about the myth. Wallace becomes larger than life. By the Renaissance, he's Scotland's Hercules, a symbol of defiance against tyranny. Never mind that he burned English villages or executed prisoners. History's not about truth, it's about stories. The pain of his execution gets polished into legend, the gore glossed over. By the 19th century, Scottish nationalism surges, and Wallace is the poster boy. Statues pop up, poems are written. The 1995 Braveheart film, pure Hollywood, kilts weren't even a thing in 1305, but it cements Wallace as a global icon. Absurdity? A 700-year-old execution still inspires blockbuster movies. Pain? The real Wallace suffered more than Mel Gibson's blue face paint ever conveyed. Back to 1305's vibe. Scotland's a land of mud, blood, and defiance. Villages are thatch and wattle, winters brutal. Survival means outsmarting wolves, bandits, and English patrols. Food's scarce. Think watery porridge, or, if you're lucky, a bit of mutton. Disease festers, a cut could kill you. The church looms large, promising salvation while blessing executions. Wallace's death, though, isn't just another body on the pile. It's a spark. Commoners start whispering his name like a prayer. Nobles, shamed by their betrayals, rally behind Bruce. The absurdity, a dead man's more powerful than a living king. What's the crowd thinking at Smithfield, watching Wallace's remains carted off? Some cheer, loyal to Edward, or just caught up in the spectacle. Others weep, seeing their own hopes butchered. The executioner, wiping his blade, probably just wants a pint. Life goes on, but not really. Wallace's head on that spike isn't just a trophy, it's a challenge. Scotland answers and history shifts. Pain, survival, absurdity, it's all there, woven into a story that refuses to die. We're not done yet. Part 4 is coming, diving into the long shadow of Wallace's legacy. How his myth shapes nations, inspires rebels, and still haunts us today. Drop a comment. Do you think Wallace's death was worth the legend? What's a modern cause you'd fight for? Keep the chat going, and let's gear up for the final chapter of this bloody bonkers tale. Here we go, folks. The final act of William Wallace's bloody saga, A tale so wild it's like history decided to write a blockbuster with extra gore and a side of existential dread. We've watched Wallace rise, fight, bleed, and meet a grisly end in 1305. His body parts turned into medieval propaganda. But this isn't where the story stops. Oh no, part 4 is about the long, twisted shadow of his legacy, how a man's torture becomes a nation's heartbeat, a myth that outlives empires, and a story that still makes us squirm, cheer, and question everything. Grab your imaginary bagpipes, maybe a tissue for the feels, and let's wrap this up with a dive into the absurdity, pain, and undying defiance that Wallace left behind. Comment below, what's the one historical figure you'd want to have a pint with, and why? Let's keep the fire burning as we close out this epic. Wallace's head is rotting on London Bridge, his limbs decorating towns like grotesque Christmas ornaments. Edward I, the self-styled Hammer of the Scots, thinks he's slammed the gavel on rebellion. Spoiler alert, he's wrong, dead wrong. The year is 1305, and Scotland's not done yet. Wallace's execution, meant to crush a nation, instead pours fuel on the fire. The common folk, those muddy, hungry peasants who saw Wallace as one of their own, aren't cowed, they're pissed. His death turns him into something bigger, a martyr, a ghost, a middle finger to English rule. The irony? Edward's over-the-top brutality creates a symbol that haunts him and his successors for centuries. Absurdity? Try this. A king so obsessed with control he accidentally hands his enemies a legend. Pain? It's the collective grief of a people who've lost their champion but found their spine. Scotland in the years after 1305 is a pressure cooker. The land's a patchwork of loyalties, nobles hedging bets, some swearing fealty to Edward, others plotting in secret. Survival means playing a dangerous game. Smile at the English garrison today, slip a dagger to the rebels tomorrow. The commoners scraping by on gruel and hope whisper Wallace's name in taverns and barns. He's not just a man anymore, he's a story. And stories, they're harder to kill than flesh. Robert the Bruce, now King of Scots after his stab-happy moment in 1306, channels this energy. He's learned from Wallace, fight smart, fight dirty, and never trust a noble with a fancy title. By 1314, Bruce's victory at Bannockburn, built on Wallace's guerrilla playbook, proves the Scots can win. The pain of that era? Endless war, families torn apart, villages burned. The absurdity? A dead man's tactics outsmarting a living empire. Let's talk about that legacy. Wallace's death doesn't just inspire Bruce, it rewrites the rules of rebellion. Before him, wars were noble affairs, knights in shining armor, lords with banners. Wallace? He's the everyman's warrior, leading farmers and blacksmiths against professional soldiers. His execution, meant to terrify, shows the world what happens when you push the little guy too far. By the 15th century, his story is immortalized by Blind Harry, a poet who spins the Wallace into a 12,000-line epic. Accuracy? Questionable. Harry's writing 150 years later, pulling from oral tales in his own imagination. Wallace becomes a superhero, 7 feet tall, slaying hundreds single-handedly, maybe wrestling bears for fun. It's historical fan fiction, but it works. Scots eat it up, their pride swelling despite English overlords still sniffing around. The pain of this myth-making? It buries the real Wallace, the man who burned English towns, executed prisoners, and probably smelled like sweat and sheep. The absurdity? That's exactly why it endures. People don't want truth, they want heroes. By the 19th century, Scottish nationalism is surging, and Wallace is the face of it. Statues rise in Aberdeen, Stirling, Edinburgh, stone tributes to a man who'd laugh at the idea of being sculpted. The Wallace Monument, built in 1869 near Stirling, towers 220 feet, a literal middle finger to England. Tourists flock, poets weep, and school kids learn his name before they learn to spell haggis. Irony? The English, who tried to erase him, now sell Wallace-themed postcards. Fast forward to 1995, and Hollywood grabs the story. Braveheart hits theaters, and Mel Gibson, with blue face paint and anachronistic kilts, makes Wallace a global icon. The film's a mess historically. Kilts weren't a thing in 1305, and that love story with the French princess? Pure fiction. But it's a banger. Audiences cheer, cry, and buy overpriced DVDs. The pain? The real Wallace's suffering is softened into a dramatic beheading, not the gut-wrenching reality of being drawn and quartered. The absurdity? A 700-year-old execution inspires Oscar-winning blockbusters and Scottish tourism ads. Visit Scotland's website today, and Wallace is everywhere. Castles, battlefields, even whiskey brands. His death, once a warning, is now a marketing tool. But let's zoom out. Why does Wallace's story hit so hard? Because it's universal. The underdog fighting the system, betrayed by his own, punished beyond reason. It's a tale that echoes across time. Think Spartacus, Joan of Arc, or modern rebels you've seen on the news. The Middle Ages were brutal, but they weren't unique. Survival then meant dodging swords. Today, it's navigating politics, economies, or social media mobs. Pain? It's the human condition. Then, now, always. Wallace's execution, with its stomach-churning details, reminds us what power looks like when it's desperate. Edward Lloyd thought he could kill an idea by killing a man. Instead, he gave that idea wings. What's the vibe of this legacy? In Scotland, it's pride mixed with defiance. The 2014 independence referendum, when Scots voted to stay or leave the UK, saw Wallace's name invoked constantly. Freedom wasn't just a movie line, it was a rally cry. Even now, in 2025, his story fuels debates about sovereignty, identity, and who gets to write history. In England, it's complicated. Some see Wallace as a terrorist, others a tragic hero. The English chroniclers of 1305 called him a monster. Today's historians grudgingly respect him. Absurdity? The same nation that spiked his head now teaches his story in schools. Let's talk about the human cost. Wallace's family, assuming he had one, faded into obscurity. His wife or lover, maybe named Marion, is a footnote, possibly killed to spark his rebellion. His men, those farmers turned fighters, mostly died in battles or faded back to their fields. The pain of 1305 wasn't just Wallace's, it was every Scot who lost hope, then found it again. Survival meant rebuilding after raids, replanting after famines, and remembering a man whose death was as much a beginning as an end. The absurdity? That one execution could ripple through centuries, shaping nations, inspiring songs, and making us care about a guy who'd be baffled by our Wi-Fi and flush toilets. The global impact? Wallace's story isn't just Scottish. It's a blueprint for resistance. From colonial uprisings to modern revolutions, the idea of one person defying an empire resonates. In the 1800s Ireland, rebels read about Wallace while plotting against British rule. In 20th century India, freedom fighters saw parallels. Even today, activists share Braveheart memes to hype their causes. The pain of oppression, universal. The absurdity of fighting it, equally so. Wallace's execution, with its grotesque spectacle, shows what's at stake when you challenge the powerful, and what you can inspire when you do. Back to the Middle Ages for a second. Life in 1305 wasn't just war and torture. It was daily grind, churning butter, mending roofs, praying the harvest didn't fail. Disease was a constant shadow. A cough could mean death. The church sold indulgences to save your soul, but not your body. Executions like Wallace's were public holidays, a break from the monotony. People watched, not just for bloodlust, but because it was something to do. Imagine that. Your entertainment is a man's guts on fire. Absurd, yet human. Wallace's death, though, wasn't just another show. It was a turning point, a story that refused to stay buried. So, where are we now? Wallace's legacy is a paradox. He's a hero, but a flawed one. He fought for freedom, but left destruction in his wake. His execution was meant to end a movement, but it birthed one. Scotland today is a nation shaped by his shadow, proud, defiant, still arguing about its place in the world. The pain of his death? It's in the history books, the statues, the songs. The absurdity? That we're still talking about a guy who died 720 years ago, his story more alive than ever. As we close this saga, think about this. What makes a legend? Is it the man, the myth, or the pain that binds them? Wallace's execution was a horror show, but it was also a spark. It lit a fire that burned through Bannockburn, through centuries to us, watching this video in 2025. So, drop a comment. What's the one thing from Wallace's story that sticks with you? Would you fight for a cause knowing it might end like his? Let's keep the conversation roaring as we say goodbye to this bloody bonkers tale. Until next time, stay curious, stay defiant, and maybe check under your bed for medieval ghosts. Picture this: you are the absolute monarch of the most powerful nation in Europe. God himself, or at least a man in a very fancy hat who claims to have God's direct phone number, has decreed that you and your family are chosen to rule. You live in a palace so vast it has its own weather system, and your breakfast routine involves more people than a modern-day tech startup. Yet, somehow, you end up on a rickety wooden stage in the middle of your capital city, with a crowd of thousands cheering for a machine designed specifically to separate your head from your shoulders. How? How does one fumble the bag that badly? This is the story of Louis XVI, the king who received the world's most severe haircut, a tale of terrible decisions, astronomical debt, and the fatal realization that the phrase, "the customer is always right," applies even when the customers are your subjects and they're armed with pitchforks. Our story begins not with a bang, but with a profoundly awkward whimper. Meet Louis Auguste, the future Louis XVI. From a young age, it was clear he wasn't exactly cut from the same cloth as his Sun-King ancestors. While his grandfather, Louis XV, was busy mastering the arts of courtly intrigue and collecting mistresses like they were Pokemon, young Louis was more interested in locks. Yes, locks and keys. He was a locksmith, a hobbyist cartographer, and an enthusiastic hunter. In another life, he would have been that quiet, slightly nerdy dad on your street who spends his weekends in the garage, meticulously organizing his tools and occasionally emerging to share a fascinating fact about metallurgy that nobody asked for. Unfortunately for him, and even more unfortunately for France, destiny had a different, far more grandiose and bloody career path in mind. He was shy, cripplingly indecisive, and about as charismatic as a damp cloth. He was, in short, the absolute worst person to be handed the keys to a kingdom that was already starting to smell faintly of smoke. His kingdom, France, was a masterpiece of absurdity, a nation teetering on the edge of a nervous breakdown while wearing a powdered wig. The society was structured like a very unstable wedding cake. At the top, you had the first estate, the clergy. These were the men of God, who owned about 10% of all the land in France and paid approximately 0% in taxes. Their primary job was to remind everyone that suffering in this life was totally fine, because heaven was basically an all-inclusive resort, a message that was much easier to deliver when you were eating swan for dinner. Below them, you had the second estate, the nobility. These were the cool kids, the descendants of medieval warlords who had traded in their rusty armor for silk stockings and a condescending sneer. They also owned a huge chunk of the land, enjoyed feudal privileges that seemed archaic even at the time, and, you guessed it, were exempt from most taxes. Their main contribution to society was looking fabulous and complaining that the new vintage of Burgundy wasn't quite as robust as the last. And then, at the very bottom, holding up this entire glittering corrupt mess, was the third estate. And who was in the third estate? Simple, everyone else. From the wealthiest banker in Paris to the poorest, most dirt-smeared peasant in the countryside, you were all lumped together in one giant overburdened category. The third estate made up about 97% of the population and paid 100% of the taxes. It was the world's most unfair group project, where two people put their feet up and the other 25 million did all the work, only to be graded with starvation and poverty. Life for the average person was a relentless grind. Bread wasn't a staple, it was a political statement. The price of a single loaf could determine whether your family ate or starved, and in the years leading up to the revolution, the price was skyrocketing. You worked from sunrise to sunset, your body ached, your children were hungry, and every time you looked up, you saw the local duke ride by on a magnificent horse, on his way to a fox hunt, splashing mud on your one good tunic. The simmering resentment was so thick you could almost taste it, and it tasted a lot like cheap, gritty bread. Into this powder keg walks a teenage girl from Austria named Maria Antonia, better known to history as Marie Antoinette. If Louis was the wrong man for the job, she was the wrong woman for for everything. She was 14, plonked into the most sophisticated and treacherous court in Europe, and married to a boy whose idea of a good time was taking a clock apart. She was homesick, bored, and utterly unprepared. The French court was a snake pit of gossip and ritual, where the act of getting dressed in the morning was a public performance with a strict hierarchy of who could hand you your chemise. Marie Antoinette hated it. She found the rules stifling and the people two-faced. So she did what any lonely, super-rich teenager would do. She built her own world. She created a bubble of fantasy and fashion. She had her own miniature village and farm built at Versailles, the Hameau de la Reine, where she and her friends could dress up as milkmaids and shepherdesses and pretend to live a simple, rustic life, complete with perfumed sheep and porcelain, buckets. It was the 18th century equivalent of an Instagram influencer curating a perfect artificial life, except her props cost more than an actual village. The rumors began to fly. She was accused of being a spy, of being promiscuous, of being a spendthrift who was bankrupting the nation with her diamond necklaces and towering hairstyles. And then there was the most famous quote never actually said, "Let them eat cake." Did she say it? Almost certainly not. But it didn't matter. It was the perfect encapsulation of what the starving people of France believed about their queen, that she was so detached, so inhumanly clueless, that she couldn't even comprehend the concept of not having bread. The meme was more powerful than the reality. What do you think? Was Marie Antoinette a malicious villain, or just a tragically misunderstood teenager and way over her head? Let me know in the comments. I'm genuinely curious what the court of public opinion decides 2 centuries later. While the queen was playing farmer and the king was cataloging his keys, the national finances were performing a swan dive into an empty swimming pool. France was broke. B-R-O-K-E. Not just we need to cut back on avocado toast, broke, but we are selling the palace furniture to pay the interest on the loan we took out to pay. The interest on the last loan, broke. Why? 2 main reasons. First, centuries of lavish spending and pointless wars by previous kings had left a mountain of debt. But the real killer, the financial coup de grace, was the American Revolution. Yes, that one. The one with George Washington and the Declaration of Independence. The French monarchy, out of a deep and abiding hatred for Great Britain, decided to bankroll the American colonists. It was the geopolitical equivalent of buying your arch-rival's worst enemy a full set of brand new power tools and an unlimited gift card to the hardware store. It was spectacularly successful in annoying the British, but it cost France a fortune they simply did not have. They spent over $1 billion livres, a sum so vast it's almost meaningless. It plunged the country into a debt spiral from which it could not recover. And who was going to pay it back? Not the church, not the nobles. No, the bill, as always, was sent to the Third Estate. But you can't squeeze blood from a stone, and you can't squeeze taxes from a populace that's already selling their shoes to buy flour. Faced with this impending economic apocalypse, King Louis XVI finally did what he did best. He dithered. He hired and fired a succession of finance ministers. One of them, Jacques Necker, a Swiss banker who was basically the 18th century's Gordon Gekko, had a brilliant idea. He suggested that maybe, just maybe, the nobility and clergy could start paying a little bit of tax. This proposal was met with the same enthusiasm as a skunk at a garden party. The privileged orders were horrified. Pay taxes, like a commoner? The very idea was insulting. They refused flat out. Louis, bless his heart, lacked the backbone to force them. He was trapped between the unmovable object of the aristocracy and the unstoppable force of national bankruptcy. Desperate, out of options, and probably suffering from a stress-induced migraine, Louis made a fateful decision. He decided to call the Estates General. This was a medieval parliamentary body that hadn't been convened in 175 years. That's how desperate he was. He was essentially digging up a political fossil, dusting it off and hoping it could solve a modern crisis. The idea was to get representatives from all 3 estates in a room together to approve new taxes. It was supposed to be a carefully managed affair, a piece of political theater to give the king's reforms a veneer of popular support. It would prove to be the single biggest miscalculation of his entire reign. The announcement was like opening a Pandora's box of grievances. For months, all across France, people gathered to elect their deputies and compile lists of complaints, the famous cahiers de doléances. These were thousands of documents detailing every frustration, big and small. Peasants complained about feudal dues and rabbits from the lord's manor eating their crops. Shopkeepers complained about arbitrary taxes and internal tariffs. Lawyers and intellectuals wrote soaring essays about natural rights, liberty, and constitutional monarchy. For the first time, the entire nation was engaged in a massive, chaotic conversation about its own future. The genie of public opinion was out of the bottle, and it was not going back in. In May 1789, the Estates General convened at Versailles. It was a visual representation of the kingdom's absurdities. The First and Second Estates arrived in their magnificent robes, plumes, and swords, looking like they'd just stepped out of a fairy tale. The Third Estate, by contrast, was ordered to wear plain, drab black, a uniform of humility. From the very beginning, the whole thing was a sham. The crucial issue was voting. Would they vote by order, meaning the clergy and nobility each had one vote, and the Third Estate had one vote, allowing the privileged two to always outvote the third? Or would they vote by head, where each of the 1,200 deputies had one vote, giving the more numerous Third Estate the advantage? The Third Estate, now filled with fiery lawyers and ambitious thinkers who had read a little too much Rousseau, refused to back down. They declared that they were not just one of three orders, but that they, and they alone, represented the nation. For weeks there was a standoff. The king waffled, the nobles fumed, the Third Estate waited. Finally, on June 20th, the deputies of the Third Estate arrived at their meeting hall to find the doors locked and guarded by soldiers. The official reason was that the hall was being prepared for a royal session, but everyone knew what it meant. It was a power play, a go to your room from the king, but they didn't go home. Instead, they did something extraordinary. Led by the charismatic astronomer Jean-Sylvain Bailly, the deputies decamped to a nearby building. It was a large, drafty, unglamorous hall. It was an indoor tennis court, and there, standing amidst the sweaty grandeur of the king's athletic facility, these men in black took a solemn oath. They swore never to separate and to reassemble wherever circumstances required, until they had established a firm and just constitution for the kingdom. This was the tennis court oath. It was a direct challenge to the king's authority. It was a declaration that sovereignty resided not in the divinely appointed monarch, but in the people themselves. In a stuffy, echoing sports hall, the French Revolution had truly begun. The king had tried to lock them out, and in doing so, he had locked himself into a collision course with history. The crowd outside was growing restless. The price of bread was still climbing. And in Paris, a medieval fortress and prison known as the Bastille stood as a looming symbol of royal tyranny. Its cannons were pointed at the city's poorest neighborhoods, a silent threat. But threats only work when people are still afraid, and the people of Paris were rapidly running out of fear. They were finding a new emotion: rage. The storm was about to break. The king was in a bind, a position he was becoming increasingly familiar with. He had tried to be firm. He had marched into the hall, declared their resolutions null and void, and ordered the three estates to go back to their separate rooms like squabbling children. The clergy and the nobility, ever the teacher's pets, dutifully obeyed. The Third Estate, however, did not. When the master of ceremonies reminded them of the king's order, the thunderous voice of Count Mirabeau, a nobleman who had slummed it and gotten himself elected to the Third Estate, boomed across the hall. "Go tell your master," he roared, "that we are here by the will of the people and we will not leave except by the force of bayonets." It was the 18th century equivalent of "You're not my real dad," and it was electrifying. Faced with this defiant teenager of a parliament, Louis did what any exhausted parent would do. He sighed, slumped his shoulders, and gave in. He ordered the other two estates to join the National Assembly. It seemed like a concession, a move towards unity. In reality, it was a surrender. The absolute monarchy had just been mugged by a bunch of lawyers in a tennis court, and the king himself had handed them his wallet. But while the king was busy losing political battles, his courtiers, led by his younger brother, the Comte d'Artois, and a rather stressed-out Marie Antoinette, were whispering in his ear. They urged him to be a man, to be a king, to sack the popular reform-minded finance minister Jacques Necker and bring in the troops. To them, the National Assembly wasn't a new form of government. It was a tumor to be removed, and Louis, ever the master of indecision, tried to have it both ways. He secretly started calling loyal, mostly foreign, military regiments to the outskirts of Paris, while publicly pretending everything was fine. On July 11th, he pulled the trigger. Necker was fired. The news hit Paris like a lit match in a fireworks factory. To the people, Necker was the only one in government on their side. His dismissal was seen as the first shot in a royalist plot to dissolve the assembly and slaughter the patriots of Paris. Panic erupted. The stock exchange closed. Theaters went dark. Waxworks of Necker were paraded through the streets like relics of a martyred saint. In the gardens of the Palais Royal, a young stuttering journalist named Camille Desmoulins leaped onto a table, drew 2 pistols, and gave the speech of his life, yelling that the dismissal of Necker was a tocsin for a St. Bartholomew's massacre of patriots. He called on the people to arm themselves. The city exploded. The next 48 hours were pure, unadulterated chaos. Mobs raided gunsmiths and arsenals looking for weapons. The problem was, they had plenty of muskets but no gunpowder, and everyone in Paris knew where the largest stash of gunpowder was stored, in a grim medieval fortress that loomed over the eastern part of the city, a symbol of royal oppression and arbitrary power. The Bastille. The original plan wasn't to storm it, it was to negotiate for the gunpowder. But negotiations between a terrified, out-of-his-depth fortress governor, the Marquis de Launay, and a massive, swirling, heavily armed, and increasingly impatient mob are not destined for success. De Launay refused. Tensions rose. Someone, somewhere, fired a shot, and then all hell broke loose. This wasn't a trained army executing a siege. This was a butcher's, a baker's, a candlestick maker's rebellion. They were firing at the stone walls with muskets, dragging cannons they barely knew how to operate. It was a bloody, desperate, and frankly pretty incompetent assault. But there were a lot of them. Inside, the garrison was mostly made up of elderly veterans, basically pensioners in uniform, who had no desire to die for a few barrels of black powder. After hours of fighting, they pressured de Launay to surrender. He did so under the promise that he and his men would not be harmed. It was a promise the mob had no intention of keeping. As de Launay was being escorted through the frenzied crowd, he was beaten, stabbed, and finally, beheaded. His head, along with that of the chief city magistrate, was stuck on a pike and paraded triumphantly through the streets of Paris. The revolution now had its first gruesome trophies. When news of the fall of the Bastille reached King Louis at Versailles, he was woken from his sleep. "Is it a revolt?" he asked the Duke who brought him the news. The Duke's reply has become legendary. "No, sire," he said. "It is a revolution." Louis's own diary entry for that day, July 14th, is perhaps even more telling. It contained a single word, rien, nothing. He'd been hunting and hadn't caught anything. A monarch so detached from reality that the storming of his capital's most infamous prison, the murder of its governor, and the complete collapse of his authority barely registered as a notable event. The fall of the Bastille was a symbolic earthquake. The king, realizing he had lost control of Paris, was forced into a humiliating act of reconciliation. He traveled from Versailles into the city, now run by a revolutionary government, the Paris Commune. At the Hôtel de Ville, the city hall, he was presented with a new symbol, the tricolor cockade, a rosette blending the red and blue of Paris with the royal white of the Bourbon monarchy. With a nervous smile, Louis pinned it to his hat. The crowd roared its approval. For a moment, it seemed like he could be a citizen king, a partner in the new France. But it was a performance. He was a king wearing the enemy's colors, a prisoner bowing to his captors. Meanwhile, the revolutionary fervor spread from the city to the countryside like a wildfire. This was the period known as the Great Fear. A wave of collective hysteria swept through rural France. Rumors flew that aristocrats were hiring bands of brigands to destroy the harvest and punish the peasants. Terrified and enraged, the peasants took matters into their own hands. They armed themselves, stormed the chateaux of their local lords, not necessarily to kill, but to find and burn the feudal charters, the centuries-old documents that listed their obligations and dues. It was a nationwide bonfire of the paperwork. Back in Versailles, the National Assembly was watching this unfold in horror. They had to do something to pacify the countryside before it descended into total anarchy. And so, on the night of August 4th, 1789, one of the most remarkable sessions in parliamentary history took place. It began with a nobleman proposing that the nobility and clergy renounce their tax privileges. This opened the floodgates. In a fit of what was later described as patriotic delirium, one aristocrat after another rose to renounce their ancient rights. Feudal dues, hunting rights, manorial courts, personal servitude, all of it was thrown onto the pyre of the old regime. In a single night, the assembly dismantled the entire legal and social framework of feudalism that had structured French life for 1,000 years. Was it a genuine change of heart, or was it the world's most panicked act of self-preservation, with nobles giving away things they knew the peasants were already taking by force? What do you think you would have done in their shoes? Confess in the comments below. Having torn down the old world, the assembly now had to define the new one. They set about drafting a founding document, a mission statement for the revolution, the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen. It was a masterpiece of Enlightenment thought, a poetic and powerful assertion of liberty, property, security, and resistance to oppression. Men are born and remain free and equal in rights. It began. It declared that all citizens were equal before the law, that sovereignty rested with the nation, and that no one could be arrested without due cause. It was a noble, beautiful, and profoundly idealistic document. It was also being written in a country that was still broke, still hungry, and deeply paranoid. King Louis, for his part, dithered yet again. He gave his half-hearted approval to the August decrees, but refused to sanction the Declaration of Rights. He was still trying to be half a king, clinging to the idea of a royal veto, a last shred of his former power. But the people of Paris weren't interested in constitutional theory. They were interested in bread. By October, the situation was dire. The bakeries were empty. Conspiracy theories flew that the aristocrats were hoarding grain to starve the people into submission. And who was the ultimate hoarder? The king, of course, the baker, as they called him. On October 5th, the breaking point was reached. It was the women of Paris who led the charge. The formidable fishwives, the market women, the working mothers who faced the daily reality of hungry children. They gathered in the central marketplace, their anger boiling over. This wasn't a political rally, it was a force of nature. Armed with kitchen knives, brooms, pikes, and even a couple of cannons they'd stolen, thousands of women began to march. Their destination, Versailles, 12 miles away. Their goal, to bring the baker, the baker's wife, and the baker's boy back to Paris where they could be watched. The March on Versailles is one of the most visceral moments of the revolution. A river of thousands of angry, drenched, and determined women, chanting for bread, flowing through the autumn rain. When they reached Versailles, they swarmed the National Assembly, shouting down the deputies, demanding action. They surrounded the palace, a sea of rage washing against the gilded gates. A delegation of women was allowed to see the king. Louis, ever awkward and surprisingly gentle, promised them he would order all the grain in Versailles to be sent to Paris. It wasn't enough. The crowd stayed all night, their mood growing uglier. In the early hours of the morning, a small group found an unlocked gate and broke into the palace, baying for the blood of the Austrian, the hated queen. They surged up the grand staircase, killing 2 of her bodyguards. Marie Antoinette barely had time to escape, fleeing through a secret passage from her bedroom to the king's chambers moments before the mob burst in, tearing her bed to shreds with their pikes. The royal family was saved from certain death by the arrival of the Marquis de Lafayette and the National Guard, but they were now completely trapped. The crowd outside was roaring, a single thunderous voice demanding one thing: to Paris! Lafayette, trying to straddle the impossible line between royal protector and revolutionary general, convinced the king to show himself on the central balcony. Louis appeared, pale and shaken, and gave a weak promise to go to Paris. The crowd cheered, but then they started chanting for the queen. La Reine! La Reine! It was a terrifying moment. Everyone knew how much they hated her. In a display of either incredible courage or fatalistic despair, Marie Antoinette stepped onto the balcony alone, with no guards, and bowed her head to the crowd below. For a long moment, there was silence. Then a shout from the crowd, "Vive la Reine!" Her bravery had for an instant won them over, but it didn't change their demand. The family had to leave Versailles. The great palace, the ultimate symbol of monarchical power and isolation, was to be abandoned. The procession that left Versailles that afternoon was one of the strangest in history. In the front, the National Guard with loaves of bread stuck on the ends of their bayonets. Then the women, marching, singing, and occasionally firing their muskets into the air. Then the royal carriage, moving at a funeral pace, containing the king, the queen, and their children. and bringing up the rear, the grim procession of the severed heads of the queen's bodyguards, their hair powdered and their lips rouged in a final grotesque mockery. The king, who had been the master of Versailles, was now a prisoner, being escorted to a new jail, the Tuileries Palace in the heart of Paris. The sun had set on the Sun King's dynasty. They were now at the mercy of the city, and the city had no mercy left. Welcome to the Tuileries Palace, the new home and five-star prison of the royal family of France. Versailles had been a symbol of absolute power, a world unto itself. The Tuileries was in the heart of Paris, a gilded cage where the bars were the peering eyes and listening ears of a city that was falling out of love with its king at an alarming rate. Louis was no longer the master of his own kingdom. He was now the city's most famous and most carefully watched resident. He could still go hunting, his one true passion, but even then he was surrounded by National Guardsmen who were less his protectors and more his parole officers. For almost 2 years, this was the new normal, a strange, tense limbo where France was technically still a monarchy, but the monarch had to check with his neighbors before he could pop out to the shops, while the royal family settled into their uncomfortable new life. The National Assembly was busy trying to write the instruction manual for a country that had just been completely disassembled. The political atmosphere was electric, a whirlwind of ideas, ambitions, and paranoia. Political clubs sprang up like mushrooms after a rainstorm. The most famous, and ultimately the most feared, was the Jacobin Club. Initially a fairly moderate group of well-to-do revolutionary thinkers, it would slowly morph into the engine of the terror. And feeding this political furnace was a new explosive force, the uncensored, utterly savage popular press. Newspapers were everywhere, and none was more influential or more bloodthirsty than L'Ami du Peuple, the friend of the people, written by Jean-Paul Marat. Marat was a failed doctor with a persecution complex and a debilitating skin condition that forced him to spend most of his time in a medicinal bath. From his tub, he penned daily tirades of rage, denouncing traitors, demanding heads, and seeing counter-revolutionary plots in every shadow. He was the revolution's chief conspiracy theorist and its high priest of vengeance, and millions of anxious, hungry Parisians read his words as gospel truth. In the middle of all this, the Assembly, in its infinite wisdom, made a catastrophic blunder. They decided that what the revolution really needed was a fight with God. With the civil constitution of the clergy, they attempted a hostile takeover of the Catholic Church in France. They seized church lands to back a new paper currency, the assignat, which promptly led to runaway inflation, proving that revolutionary economics are just as messy as regular economics. But the real disaster was the loyalty oath. All priests and bishops were required to swear an oath of allegiance to the new constitution, placing the state above the Pope in Rome. For many, this was an impossible demand. It split the clergy and the nation in two. You now had juring priests who took the oath, and non-juring priests who refused. For a deeply pious man like King Louis XVI, this was the last straw. The revolution had taken his power, his freedom, and his palace. Now it was coming for his soul. He saw the civil constitution as a declaration of war on God himself, and it convinced him that this revolution was not just misguided, but evil. He officially sanctioned the document, as he had to, but in his heart, he believed he had committed a mortal sin. It was time to get out. What followed was the worst road trip in history, the flight to Varennes. The plan was hatched in secret, with the help of the dashing Swedish Count Axel von Fersen, who was almost certainly the Queen's lover, and was definitely more competent than anyone in the King's immediate family. The goal was to sneak out of Paris, travel east to the fortress of Montmédy near the border, and rally loyalist troops. From there, the King hoped to renegotiate the revolution from a position of strength, or perhaps even lead a counter-revolution with the help of his brother-in-law, the Emperor of Austria. The escape itself was a masterpiece of aristocratic cluelessness. Instead of traveling in two small, fast, inconspicuous carriages, they commissioned a single enormous brand new coach, painted a conspicuous dark green and yellow, and loaded with every creature comfort they could imagine. It was the 18th century equivalent of trying to sneak out of a war zone in a custom-built luxury RV. On the night of June 20th, 1791, the escape began. The royal family, disguised as the entourage of a Russian baroness, with the king, the 6-foot-plus monarch, ludicrously dressed as her valet, slipped out of the Tuileries one by one. The first part actually worked. They were out of Paris, but the plan was already falling apart. The massive coach was slow, drawing attention everywhere it went and falling hours behind schedule. The royalist cavalry detachments that were supposed to meet them and escort them along the route either got bored and left or were spooked by suspicious locals. The whole operation was a cascade of amateurish errors. The fatal moment came in the small town of Sainte-Menehould. As the coach stopped to change horses, a local postmaster named Jean-Baptiste Drouet, a fiery former soldier and staunch revolutionary, looked at the face of the supposed valet. Something was familiar. He compared the man's profile to the portrait of the king on a new 50-livre assignat banknote he had in his pocket. It was a match. The valet was the king. Drouet didn't raise the alarm immediately. Instead, he let the coach leave and then took a shortcut across the woods on horseback, riding like a man possessed to the next town on the route, Varennes-en-Argonne, to cut them off. He arrived just ahead of the royal carriage, rousing the town with cries of, "The king is escaping!" A group of local patriots hastily blocked the bridge out of town with an overturned cart of furniture. When the king's coach rumbled into the dark, silent town square, it was surrounded. The game was up. A local official, a grocer named Sauce, politely asked for their passports. Trapped and exhausted, Louis finally admitted who he was. "Yes," he said, "I am your king." They were detained in Sauce's house above his grocery shop for the night. The king of France and Navarre, a descendant of 1,000 years of monarchs, was now a prisoner in a grocer's spare bedroom. This was the point of no return. Do you think if the escape had succeeded, the monarchy could have been restored? Or was it just delaying the inevitable? Debate it in the comments. Let's see what alternate histories you can cook up. The journey back to Paris was a national humiliation. The massive coach trundled back west, surrounded by crowds of citizens who were no longer cheering or curious, but silent and hostile. The assembly had dispatched deputies to escort them, posting orders along the route that anyone who applauded the king would be flogged, and anyone who insulted him would be hanged. The result was an unnerving, deafening silence. When they re-entered Paris, hundreds of thousands lined the streets, every man pointedly keeping his hat on his head in a collective gesture of profound disrespect. The royal family was returned to the Tuileries, but this time there were no illusions. The cage was now locked and bolted. The king had not just tried to escape, he had tried to run away to the enemy. He had left behind a letter denouncing the revolution. He was no longer seen as a misguided father of the people. He was a liar and a traitor. The magic of monarchy, the divine aura that had surrounded the king for centuries, was shattered. How can you be a king of a country you tried to flee? The word republic started to be whispered, not just by radicals in the Jacobin clubs, but by ordinary people in the streets. The failed escape polarized the nation. The radicals now had all the proof they needed that the king could not be trusted, and that the monarchy itself was a threat to the revolution. In July 1791, a crowd gathered on the Champ de Mars, the Field of Mars, to sign a petition demanding the king's abdication and the establishment of a republic. The Paris Commune, controlled by the more moderate faction, declared martial law. Lafayette and the National Guard were sent to disperse the crowd. Things got out of hand. The guards opened fire, killing as many as 50 people. The Champ de Mars massacre was a brutal turning point. The revolution was now, for the first time, fighting itself. The blood on the field was not that of royalists or aristocrats. It was the blood of fellow patriots, spilled by other patriots. The unity of 1789 was dead. Into this toxic brew of internal division and paranoia, a new element was added, the threat of foreign war. The monarchs of Europe had watched the French Revolution with growing alarm. They were not particularly fond of Louis XVI, but they were very fond of the idea of monarchy itself. The Emperor of Austria and the King of Prussia issued the Declaration of Pillnitz, a vaguely worded threat to restore the power of the French king, which they mostly intended as a bluff. In France, however, it was taken as a declaration of intent to invade. This played directly into the hands of a new faction that was gaining power in the assembly, the Girondins. They were fiery orators who believed that the revolution needed a glorious foreign war to unite the country, flush out its internal enemies, and export the principles of liberty to the rest of Europe. It was a terribly romantic and colossally dangerous idea. In an atmosphere of patriotic hysteria, They pushed for a preemptive strike. The king, ironically, also supported the war, but for his own reasons. He foolishly believed that if France went to war, it would either lose, in which case the invading Austrian and Prussian armies would restore his power, or it would win, which would make him popular as a victorious wartime leader. It was the ultimate political gamble, a win-win scenario that could only possibly end in total disaster. In April 1792, France declared war on Austria. The French Revolutionary Wars had begun, a conflict that would engulf Europe for more than 2 decades. The war started terribly. The French army was in disarray, disorganized by revolution and missing most of its aristocratic officers who had fled abroad. They suffered a series of humiliating defeats. Back in Paris, fear and paranoia reached fever pitch. The defeats were blamed on traitors, on the Austrians, and, of course, on the Austrian Committee, supposedly being run by Marie Antoinette out of the Tuileries. In July, the commander of the Allied Prussian and Austrian armies, the Duke of Brunswick, issued a manifesto that would seal the king's fate. The Brunswick Manifesto threatened that if the royal family was harmed, the Allies would inflict an exemplary and forever memorable vengeance, and subject the city of Paris to military execution and total destruction. It was intended to frighten the revolutionaries into submission. It did the exact opposite. It was proof positive that the king was in league with the enemy. It was a direct challenge to a nation that had discovered its own ferocious pride. The response was not fear, but incandescent rage. On August 10, 1792, the breaking point was finally reached. At dawn, the revolutionary alarm bells rang out across Paris. An army of thousands of radical National Guardsmen, the fédérés and the Parisian working class, the sans-culottes, marched on the Tuileries Palace. The palace was defended by about 950 Swiss guards, some loyal National Guardsmen, and a few hundred gentlemen at arms. It was a desperate, hopeless situation. As the mob surged into the palace courtyard, the king and his family made a fateful decision. They abandoned the palace and their defenders, fleeing across the gardens to the nearby hall, where the Legislative Assembly was in session, seeking its protection. By leaving, Louis ensured his family's survival, but he doomed his last defenders. Left without clear orders, the Swiss Guard did what they were trained to do. They defended their post. They opened fire on the crowd, initially driving them back. But the mob was immense. They returned with cannons, and the battle turned into a brutal no-quarter slaughter. The Swiss were hunted down through the corridors and gardens of the palace and massacred. Of the 950 guards, more than 600 were killed in the fighting or murdered afterwards. Their red uniforms became a symbol of heroic, feudal loyalty. By the end of the day, the Tuileries Palace had been stormed, the Swiss Guard annihilated, and the Assembly, under duress from the victorious mob, had voted to suspend the monarchy. Louis XVI and his family were taken from the Assembly Hall and imprisoned in the Temple, a grim medieval fortress in Paris. He was no longer a king, not even a constitutional one. He was citizen Louis Capet, a prisoner awaiting trial. The 1,000-year-old French monarchy was finished. The guillotine was being assembled, and it was thirsty. The monarchy was dead. Long live the... Well, nobody was quite sure yet. In the wake of the August 10th insurrection, France found itself in a bizarre new reality. The Legislative Assembly, having suspended the king, essentially dissolved itself and called for a new government to be elected by universal male suffrage. This new body would be called the National Convention, and its first order of business on its very first day, September the 21st, 1792, was to formally abolish the monarchy and declare France a republic. After 1,000 years, the throne was officially empty. The nation had woken up with a political hangover and decided to completely redecorate. And what of the former king? Louis, Marie Antoinette, their children, and Louis's sister, Madame Elizabeth, were now state prisoners, housed in the forbidding medieval tower of the Temple. Their new life was a surreal blend of mundane domesticity and mortal terror. They were stripped of all titles and were now referred to simply as the Capet family, a reference to a distant medieval ancestor, a final humiliation designed to erase their royal status. Louis, stripped of his kingdom, finally had all the time in the world to be what he had always been best at, being a father. He gave his son lessons in geography, read Latin with him, and played games. The family ate their meals together under the constant watch of guards. their dinner conversations punctuated by the revolutionary songs being sung on the streets outside. It was a pathetic, tragic, and deeply human scene. A family trying to maintain the fiction of normalcy while the world outside was actively debating the best way to kill them. That world was spiraling into a new and terrifying phase of paranoia and violence. The war was going disastrously. The Prussian army was advancing, and the fortress of Verdun, the last major obstacle on the road to Paris, had fallen. Panic gripped the capital. The fear was that the city's prisons, filled with suspected counter-revolutionaries, priests, and aristocrats, were a fifth column waiting to happen. What if they broke out and attacked the city from within while the Prussian army attacked from without? Jean-Paul Marat from his bathtub command center screamed for blood. "Let the blood of traitors flow," he wrote, and so it did. In the first week of September, an event of horrifying brutality unfolded, the September massacres. For 4 days, mobs of sans-culottes, sometimes with the tacit approval of revolutionary authorities, dragged prisoners from their cells, subjected them to sham trials, and then hacked them to pieces in the prison courtyards. Over 1,200 people were slaughtered: priests, Swiss guards who had survived August 10th, political prisoners, and hundreds of common criminals who just happened to be in the wrong jail at the wrong time. It was an explosion of primal fear and homicidal rage, and it sent a clear message. In this new republic, justice was swift, bloody, and wielded by the mob. For the prisoner in the temple, the message was unmistakable. This is what the revolution does to its enemies. You are next. With the Prussian threat turned back at the Battle of Valmy, the National Convention could finally turn its full attention to its most pressing piece of old business: what to do with citizen Louis Capet. The debate was fierce. The more moderate Joan faction was squeamish. They feared that executing the king would provoke the rest of Europe into an all-out war and destabilize their fragile new republic. They argued for imprisonment or exile, but they were up against the hard men of the mountain, the radical Jacobins who sat on the upper benches of the convention hall. Their leaders, like the calculating and incorruptible Maximilien Robespierre, saw the king's trial not as a legal matter, but as a political necessity. It was their young, handsome, and terrifyingly dogmatic ideologue, Louis-Antoine de Saint-Just, who put it most chillingly. "One cannot reign innocently," he declared from the tribune. The king was not a citizen who had committed a crime. He was an enemy, a monster outside the social contract. To try him was to admit he could be innocent. This man, Saint-Just argued, must reign or die. For the Montagnards, the revolution and the king could not both exist. For the republic to live, the king had to die. Any lingering doubts about the king's guilt were vaporized in late November with the discovery of the Armoire de Fer, an iron chest hidden behind a panel in the Tuileries Palace. Inside was Louis's secret correspondence. It was the smoking gun, the ultimate proof of his duplicity. Letters to Austrian officials, dealings with émigré nobles, plans to thwart the revolution. It was all there. His treason in the eyes of the convention was now proven beyond all doubt. The trial was set. On December 11, 1792, a pale but composed Louis XVI was brought before the National Convention to be formally charged. The president of the convention read out the indictment, a long list of 33 charges covering his entire reign, from supposedly sending troops to crush the Estates General in 1789 to the massacre of the Swiss Guard. "Louis," the president began, dispensing with all titles, "the French nation accuses you." Louis listened patiently, and then with the help of his brilliant young lawyer, Raymond de Sèze, he began his defense. He was surprisingly effective. He calmly and precisely answered each charge, citing his rights under the Constitution that they themselves had written. He denied knowledge of the iron chest. He argued that his actions had always been within the laws of the time. De Sèze gave a brilliant closing argument, appealing to history and to law, reminding the deputies that they were acting as both prosecutors and jury. But it was useless. This was not a trial. It was a political ritual. The verdict was a foregone conclusion. The voting in the convention began on January 15th, 1793. It was a spectacle of high political drama. 3 questions were put to the 721 deputies. First, is Louis Capet guilty of conspiracy against public liberty and of attacks on the general security of the state? The vote was overwhelming, 693 for guilty, with none voting for outright acquittal. The second question was a Girondin attempt to save him. Should the sentence be submitted to the people for ratification? This was rejected, sealing the king's fate in the hands of the convention. Finally, the third and most terrible question: what penalty shall be inflicted upon Louis? The voting on this last question began in the evening and lasted for over 24 hours. Each deputy had to walk to the tribune, face his colleagues in the packed public galleries, and declare his vote aloud. The pressure was immense. One by one, they came forward: death, imprisonment and banishment, death with a delay. The most shocking vote came from the king's own cousin, the Duc d'Orléans, who had restyled himself Philippe Égalité, Philip Equality. He walked to the tribune, and, to the gasps of many, voted for la mort, death. When the final tally was read, the result was horrifically close. 361 voted for death without conditions, an exact majority of 1. Louis XVI was condemned to die. Louis received the news with quiet dignity. He was allowed a final meeting with his family. On the evening of January 20th, Marie Antoinette, his children, and his sister were brought to his room. The reunion was agonizing. They clung to him, weeping for 2 hours. The guards outside could hear their sobs. He told his son never to seek revenge for his death. He promised them he would see them again in the morning before the end, a promise he knew he would not keep, to spare them the final traumatic farewell on the day of the execution. After they were torn away from him, he spent the rest of the night with his chosen confessor, a non-juring Irish priest named Henry Essex Edgeworth. The morning of January 21st, 1793, was cold and foggy. A carriage waited to take the condemned man on his final journey. The city was on lockdown, with 80,000 soldiers lining the route to prevent any rescue attempt or riot. The 2-hour procession from the temple to the Place de la Révolution, today's Place de la Concorde, was eerily silent. Louis spent the time reading from a book of Psalms. In the center of the vast square stood the new star of the revolution, the machine that promised a swift and egalitarian death for all, the guillotine. As Louis stepped out of the carriage, he was met by the executioner, Charles-Henri Sanson. When Sanson's assistants moved to bind his hands, Louis initially refused. "I will not have my hands tied," he protested. A brief struggle ensued before his priest whispered to him, reminding him of the submission of Christ. Louis relented. "Do as you will," he said. "I will drink the cup to the dregs." His hair was cut. He mounted the steps of the scaffold. He stood before the vast, silent crowd, and with a powerful voice tried to make one last speech. "I die innocent of all the crimes laid to my charge," he began. "I pardon those who have occasioned my death, and I pray to God that the blood you are about to shed may never be visited on France." He was not allowed to finish. The commander of the National Guard, a brewer named Santerre, ordered a drum roll to drown out the king's voice. They could not risk his last words turning the crowd's mood. Louis was quickly strapped to the plank. The blade fell. A young guard picked up the severed head and showed it to the 4 corners of the square. A great roar finally erupted from the crowd. "Vive la République!" The spell was broken. People rushed forward to dip their handkerchiefs, their pikes, their swords in the king's blood, to keep as a grim souvenir of the day they killed a king. And so our story ends. The quiet locksmith, the awkward boy who wanted to be a good man but was fated to be a king, ended his life as a bloody trophy. He was not a tyrant. He was not a saint. He was a man of profound mediocrity, whose indecisiveness and lack of imagination were fatal flaws when faced with the whirlwind of history. His tragedy was not that he was evil, but that he was simply not up to the job. He was a man who inherited a burning building and tried to put out the fire by forming a committee. So, what's the final verdict from the court of history? Was Louis XVI a traitor who got what he deserved, a tyrant who paid the ultimate price for his crimes against the people? Or was he a tragic, flawed victim, a man crushed by historical forces far beyond his control? Was his death a necessary act to found a new republic? Or was it the original sin that led France down the path to the bloodbath of the terror? Let me know your judgment in the comments below. The king is dead. History is now in session. Hey guys, imagine a narrow night of smoke and wet rope, 6 men with maps, 1 pile of barrels, and a single misdirected letter that unravels everything. Before you get comfortable, please hit like and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy what I do. Drop a comment telling me where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's dive together into today's journey. They call it the Gunpowder plot, and the name slides smoothly onto commemorative badges and bonfire night rhymes, as if the whole affair were a tidy moral tale. But history stubbornly refuses tidy. The men behind the plan, Robert Catesby, Thomas Percy, John Wright, Guy Fawkes, and a handful of others, were not villainous chess pieces. They were quarrelsome human beings with debts, grudges, spiritual injuries, and a startling appetite for theatrical solutions. They argued like men trying to decide the color of the curtain for a very public catastrophe, earnest, petty, and occasionally inventive. Guy Fawkes is the face everybody remembers because the fates enjoy irony and bureaucracies enjoy a scapegoat. He was, by trade and temperament, the one who understood barrels, matches, and the practicalities of making things go bang. In other words, if you were staging a terrible lesson in political architecture, he was the engineer you hired. But remember this, the human who hauls the gunpowder is never the whole story. Names stick for odd reasons. One man becomes a poster child in a millennia-long joke, and the rest of the people become footnotes in pamphlets. The plan itself had the anatomy of a melodrama. Men gathered in small shadowed rooms, maps spread like sacramental objects, discussing angles and timetables with the fervor of conspirators who had read more tragedy than sense. Some reasons were ideological, a Catholic minority pressed against the wall by Protestant policies, and some reasons were painfully human, ruinous debts, bruised pride, and the intoxicating idea that a single dramatic act might reorder a society. That felt oppressive. They composed themselves as if they were writing a play. They neglected the things plays rarely worry about, like post-explosion rubble and the paperwork of punishment. And so the plot, which could have been an efficient calamity on paper, is undone by the very human banality of a letter. A worried noble writes to a friend about where the king might be on the day Parliament sits. The letter circulates, curiosity becomes official obligation, and the authorities, alerted, search the cellars beneath the House of Lords and find a man with matches and barrels. It is almost laughably modern. A private note, sent with ordinary caution, ends the spectacular scheme. Here is the first of many ironies. A conspiracy predicated on secrecy dies by the slow, normalizing force of ordinary human worry. When the arrest is made, the machinery of the state revs into a macabre form of efficiency. Arrests, guard details, interrogations, officials who speak in phrases meant for printing rather than for thought. The law is performed as much as it is applied. Treason requires not mere execution. It requires a spectacle that teaches, in the bluntest way possible, a lesson about obedience. The condemned must be displayed in a curriculum of horror so persuasive that the populace will, at the very least, be convinced to pretend to feel appropriately horrified. This is where the story veers into grotesque theater. The legal sentence for high treason at the time is elaborate to the point of absurdity. Hanging, drawing, and quartering. An itinerary of humiliations calculated to mark the transgressor's body physically in the civic imagination. The state meant for the punishment to be a sermon, spoken in flesh, so that anyone who witnessed it might learn not to condense dissent into explosives. But the problem with rituals is they assume that the human elements, ropes, executioners, weather, the condemned's own stubbornness, will comply with the state's dramaturgy. Guy Fawkes' last hours are a study in small negotiations, between fear and defiance, between the flesh's unpredictable responses and the state's desire for a clean lesson. Arrest and interrogation operated in a gray zone. Torture, while not always printed in statutes, was tacitly accepted when authorities desired a useful confession. Men subjected to such pressures do not only reveal facts, they reveal strategies for survival, names chosen to bargain, and sometimes lies that are plausible enough to satisfy inquisitors and not fatally implicate friends. Confession becomes a kind of improvised diplomacy between a man and the machinery that seeks to break him. Public executions were, in that era, a civic classroom. The scaffold was front row for everyone, vendors hawking pastries behind the benches, children slipping between adults' legs to peek at a ritual that was at once frightening and oddly ordinary. People came to learn what treason looked like, to witness the fate of those who stepped outside the acceptable script. Life chugged on at the outskirts. Merchants haggled, messengers rushed past with dispatches, and small dogfights over bread occurred beneath the shadow of an executioner's platform. The coexistence of ordinary life and theatrical cruelty is one of the bitterest contrasts in this story. The state's desire for an image, a perfect exemplar of shame, often collided with the messy realities of the human body and bungled logistics. Executioners were craftsmen of a kind, not saints of efficiency. Ropes frayed, knots slipped, a pulley protested, weather made things colder or wetter than planners had imagined. In some recorded moments, the condemned resisted more than the officials expected, and the spectacle spiraled into improvisation. Additional knots, rushed instructions, a messy, awkward attempt to salvage the moral lesson from technical failure. There is darkly comic humanity in the image of men in wigs fussing over phrasing for an official proclamation, while a live body shivers on a scaffold. If the aim was to intimidate the populace into a uniform feeling of devotion to order, the outcome was not so neat. Witnesses left with a variety of stories, some with horror, others with relief, and some with gossip that would seed pamphlets and jokes. The cruelty meant to generate unquestioning obedience instead brewed rumor and skepticism. The spectacle, designed to be a tidy civics lesson, often became the kind of messy public event that produces gossip, and gossip is the salt that preserves political memory in unpredictable ways. Another delicious irony is what time does to symbols. Guy Fawkes, designed by his era to be a cautionary exemplar of a failed treason, is centuries later recast as a symbol of dissent. The man who was meant to be shamed becomes the face of a masked protest, a brand of anonymity that ridicules the very state that once used him to instill obedience. It's an elegant historical rebound. An instrument of shame morphs into an emblem for those who resist, often peacefully, the institutions that once chopped men into pieces for the sake of example. Symbols have a funny way of escaping the moral gravity of their origin, but we must not romanticize the reclaimed image and forget the people who bore the spectacle's blunt instruments. The families left behind, wives, children, siblings, were not political metaphors. They were survivors piecing lives together amid rumors in the state's official narrative. The public performance of punishment didn't only discipline the condemned, it disciplined the living who remained. People had to answer for their proximity to the accused. Did you know him? Why did you keep company? Those ordinary human reckonings were the collateral of political theater. Take a moment to picture the tiny administrative cruelties. Officials debating how to parcel a body for display without alarming foreign courts. Clerks arguing over the phrasing of a proclamation that would be printed and read aloud. The meticulous concern for appearances, while the main point, the person on the scaffold, remained unbearably real. This juxtaposition between image management and human suffering is where the strange moral lesson emerges. The political class can be more concerned with optics than with the messy ethics of what it enacts, and yet, amid the absurdity, there is a kind of stubborn tenderness. Markets reopened, life resumed. Children who watched the spectacle grew into adults who told their own versions of the story, inflamed by trauma or wryness or both. Humor emerges as a survival mechanism. People make jokes to exercise horror. They turn suffering into ritual and then into satire. The adoption of Fawkes's visage centuries later, a mask used by protesters and pranksters, is both a reclaiming and a flattening. It honors the principle of dissent without requiring an agreement with the man's method. This is how trauma becomes mythology, stripped of nuance, repurposed into a symbol that fits contemporary needs. The Gunpowder plot therefore reads as both a tragic miscalculation and a case study in how societies attempt to teach through suffering. The conspirators misjudged the resilience of ordinary communication, and the state misjudged the ideological returns from public spectacle. Both miscalculations produced a narrative that, over time, would be rebundled, simplified, and sold as a moral lesson. The man who tinkered with gunpowder became a mask. The execution that was meant to terrify became fuel for satire. History, in this instance, behaves like an unreliable editor, cutting, reshaping, and sometimes making jokes over the footnote. If this midnight theater intrigues or unsettles you, and why wouldn't it? Drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is. I read them, and I love seeing how this grim little corner of history resonates across time zones. Do you think our spectacles are any better than theirs? Are we more humane or just more efficient at narrating cruelty? In the next part, we'll pry open the interrogation chamber itself, read between the lines of confessions rendered under pressure, and look at how pamphlets and rumors stitch themselves into the public's conscience. We'll also follow how Guy Fawkes' clumsy, very human execution rippled outward, becoming myth, ritual, and eventually a curious emblem of protest that the original plotters could neither have imagined nor approved. We pry open the interrogation chamber like one might peel back a rotten apple and pretend the core still smells of citrus. There is a light in the room, not the forgiving kind, but the clinical kind that makes men look smaller and their lies look larger. Walls stained from 100 human failures, a table that has held more confessions than clean ink wells, and hands, so many hands, that have learned to squeeze, let go, and then squeeze again. The point of an interrogation is not merely to extract facts, it is to remake a life into a shape the state can exhibit with neatness. What you want to know is rarely what the authorities want to show. Theirs is a museum of narratives. Your life must be framed and labeled. Imagine the men brought in one by one, still smelling faintly of their last shelter. Sweat, wet wool, the ghost of tobacco from a hurried smoke. They are not yet fully dead to the world. Terror has not yet made them entirely polite. They speak in fragments, names that sound like passwords, places that might as well be foreign cities because the mind is already disassociating, dates that are hazy because days blur into the recitation of what will save you. The first admissions are often a theater of minimization. It was only talk. We meant only to frighten. I hardly knew. These are soft defenses used by people who hope the state prefers a plausible story over the hard work of proof. Torture, or its threat like a constant cough in the room, changes the grammar of confession. Under pressure, the voice grows eager to be believed because belief equals reprieve. Men will give up names they never meant to speak, or names they give with the desperation of someone dealing out cards that might be trumps. The authorities, reading these deals, do not always distinguish between the conjured and the real. A person under duress will often hand over a map of acquaintances that looks like a treasury ledger. Some names are true, some are guesses, some are recycled to save a life. The political result is a tangle. Friends become suspects, acquaintances become suspects' names, and the web widens until the original knot becomes indistinguishable. In the middle of an interrogation, the scene becomes a sort of theater of procedural cruelty. Officials speak in the measured cadences of the law, while the interrogated respond in breathy, collapsing lines. At times, the two languages, legalese and panic, meet, and out of that collision comes a confession that is half bargain, half capitulation. The confessor often tries to control the narrative, even as control is being wrested away. They pick and choose which sins to admit aloud, which to muffle, hoping, with a specificity that is almost comic, that if they confess minor complicity, they might be spared the full weight of accusation. A confession, once written, is a peculiar relic. It is a ghostly thing, part memory, part performance. The scribe who records it is not a neutral archivist. He shapes syntax, smooths taut edges, and sometimes edits for public digestibility. The recorded confession is later read aloud in courts and printed in pamphlets, where the messy human fever that birthed it is turned into tidy paragraphs and moral lessons. The confession becomes a pliable artifact, repurposed to tell the story the authorities prefer. Look, justice is done, villains are exposed. Only seldom does the public consider the ways the confession was negotiated, the pauses where the pen hovered, the cough that interrupted a sentence and shifted its meaning. While confessions are inked, the other machinery whirs, pamphleteers, sermons, and rumor mongers. The sixpence pamphlet is the social media of its time, crude, combustible, and capable of setting off fires of its own. A neat confession is printed with a flourish and sent into the hands of readers who will read parts aloud in taverns, rewriting the story as they go. Some will turn the confession into a parable about faithfulness. Others will glorify the ineptitude of the conspirators. Publishers, with their fingers to the pulse of what sells, choose sensationalism over nuance every time. The world eats the simplest version of a story and burps out caricature. Pamphlets have a delightful cruelty. They do not merely report, they shape memory. Years after the event, people will recall what they read rather than what they saw. An eyewitness account becomes a quotation from a pamphlet. An incident becomes the line from a sermon. In that sense, the public's relationship with truth is mediated by printers who can be enthusiastic, opportunistic, or incompetent. A man's refusal to give a name might be turned into a character flaw. An executioner's bungled knot becomes divine retribution in the hands of a clever pamphleteer. The truth is folded to fit the page. Then there are the domestic consequences, the bitter, intimate economy of survival after treason. Families are stripped not only of bread, but of respectability. Neighbors cross the street as if proximity were contagious. A wife who once argued over pork prices now finds her door a subject of gossip. A child who used to play in the yard is hushed for fear of polite society's judgment. The community becomes a tribunal of its own. In a cruel symmetry, private lives are punished as surely as public ones. The law may be satisfied with a public execution, but society exacts its own, slower form of penance that continues for generations. The trial is a necessary pageant. There must be a proclamation, a reading of charges, a performance of justice. Judges, resplendent in robes, are actors in a ritual that aims to reassure the populace. The legal system functions, order holds, and the punishment meted is both merciful and precise. But trials, like theater, can be staged. Witnesses are coaxed into dramatic testimony. The prosecutors arrange facts for effect. The judges paraphrase serious things into sentences that will be printed and pasted. The accused stand not only for themselves, but also for a narrative. The story of a government that will not be toppled by booze-soaked conspirators with theatrical ambitions. The language used by the judiciary and the press is a fascinating study in moral grammar. Words do heavy lifting. Treason becomes a bludgeon. Plot is a tidy box enclosing all manner of messy human motives. The state's lexicon compresses complexity into categories that are easy to scream about at the pub. When you hear a crowd chant a single word of outrage, what they are really cheering is the category that lets them sleep without wrestling with the contradictions of governance. Meanwhile, the conspirators themselves become increasingly mythologized even before their bones grow cold. Some are painted as devils, others as poorly coached martyrs. The human details, the debts and betrayals that led them to sit in rain-soaked rooms and dream of fireworks and regime change, are smoothed into single-color silhouettes. This is human nature. We prefer our villains in uniform, with clear motifs, as if that made the lesson more digestible. But real people are multi-toned, with petty loves and odd fears, and their motives are an unsatisfying mess. Let us turn to Holbesch House for a moment, that last desperate act in which the plotters' plans bleed into farce. They rendezvous, injured and wet, thinking themselves like tragic heroes escaping to a better ending. Instead, they find themselves in a senseless scuffle with an uncooperative gunpowder cache. The image is almost slapstick. Men bent over barrels that refuse to cooperate. Rain making gunpowder sodden. Someone misjudging a wick, a spark that sputters instead of detonating. In that small theater of failure, the tragic and comedic meet. Violence, when it is earnest and bungled, looks ridiculous and horrifying at once. What follows is a cascade of outcomes. Some of the conspirators die on the run, some are captured and brought to trial, and some attempt feints of penitence. The state needs some to die quickly to show severity, some to be displayed to show consequence, and others to be paraded like specimens of redemption. Each fate serves a narrative need, not necessarily a moral one. The bodies, or the lack thereof, are choreographed to fit an ethical script designed by those who prefer tidy endings. Meanwhile, in churches and taverns, people find their own ways to process the spectacle. Clergymen preach sermons that connect piety with obedience, a tidy theological equation that spares them the harder philosophical labor of asking why men felt compelled to plot in the first place. Tavern talk, in contrast, is more honest and more dangerous. There, patrons will mutter about taxes, about being harried by officials, about the indignities of daily life. These informal exchanges are the real barometer of public mood, though authorities prefer to listen to pews rather than in crowds. And of course, there is performative ritual that follows. Bonfires, effigies, rhymes that drill the state's lesson into children who will one day be the tax collectors and clerks of a new century. The effigy of a man who once carried barrels becomes a puppet for communal ridicule. It is easy to forget that a real person is being mocked when the mockery becomes ritualized. Ritual has a numbing effect. Over time, the bonfire's heat warms not only the body but the public's sense of moral righteousness. People gather to roast potatoes and rehearse their allegiance to order. convinced they are celebrating wisdom rather than merely performing the mechanics of civic solidarity. Remarkably, the turning of atrocity into entertainment does not always result in consent. Sometimes people use the ritual as a moment to question. A joke whispered at the edge of the bonfire can be sharper than a sermon. The mask of laughter can be a veil for dissent. The song that lampoons authority can be a radical act. Popular culture, even when appropriating state narratives, finds loopholes for resistance. Those who are clever with irony will always find ways to poke at the edifice, to expose its seams. And so we return, inevitable and a little tired, to Guy Fawkes himself, or rather to the image that bears his name. The real man was a private actor in a public drama. The symbol that later bears his face has little to do with his motives, and more with what generations needed from him. He becomes a cipher, someone whose literal life is less interesting than the uses people make of his memory. Later crowds, who have no patience for historic nuance, will wear his face in protest. They will strip the man of his specifics and wear the mask as a banner against power. In the hands of a later world, the man who was once the face of shame becomes the face of anonymous defiance. History plays visual chess with symbols, and the pieces change value depending on who is moving them. If you're still with me, scroll-stalling horror or morbid curiosity, take your pick. Drop a quick line in the comments telling me which part of this mess you'd want to live through for a week. No permanent residency, of course. Would you prefer the pamphlet-stained press room, the interrogation chamber with its clinical light, or the ham-fisted panic at Holbesch House? I read these, and your choices tell me how you imagine human endurance, in gossip, in silence, or in misfired explosives. As we close this part, remember that the afterlife of an event is often more interesting than the event itself. The bones of the plot, the arrests, the confessions, the executions, are the pages we can turn. The margins, where rumor, pamphlet, private grief, and public ritual fight for meaning, are where the real story survives. People do not simply internalize lesson plans. They translate them into gossip, food, fashion, songs, and jokes. Through these small acts, history becomes not a single narrative, but a crowded room of competing voices. In the next segment, we'll map those voices, the satirists, the sorrowful widows, the enterprising printers, and the slow-drying ink of law. We'll see how a single night's failure bleeds into generations' memory, and how a man engineered by fate becomes an emblem engineered by later hands. They burned him in memory long before they burned his name into ritual. After the smoke cleared and the embers cooled, what remained wasn't merely the ash of a night gone wrong. It was 1,000 small combustions of imagination. People needed stories they could carry to bed, proverbs to recite at market stalls, and simple villains to pin tedious anxieties on. So the plot was folded into nursery rhymes, sermons, and the noisy theater of public recreation. The consequences were mundane, repetitive, and excellent at shaping how a society remembers itself. Public memory is not a museum curated by historians. It's a flea market of anecdotes and cheap prints. Printers, those entrepreneurial alchemists of paper and ink, smelled opportunity the way wolves smell blood. A sensational confession printed on rag paper could be sold and resold. A broadsheet reprinted the official narrative so often that the raw, bleeding details were dried into slogans. By morning, a scandalous story from the cellar beneath Parliament became a handful of tidy sentences tossed across the city by shopboys and repeated by men who wanted to sound informed in taverns. The truth of the night was replaced by repeating patterns that fit a public appetite: intrigue, villainy, retribution. The bonfires came first as a kind of civic exhalation. Communities lit fires to celebrate survival and to say aloud, in flames and smoke, that order had prevailed. But once ritualized, the bonfire does not simply represent the event it commemorates. It becomes a social mechanism. People gather, roast potatoes, and practice their civic loyalty in chorus. Children are given rhymes that compress a political catastrophe into a mnemonic jingle. Remember, remember, the 5th of November, a line designed to be remembered, not to be understood. Over time, the song works like a spoon, stirring the soup of collective memory until the ingredients are indistinguishable. Effigies are more sophisticated than they look. They do not merely mock a man, they do the harder work of transforming guilt into spectacle. Building an effigy requires thought. What features do you emphasize? The face? The gait? The props? The puppet of Guy Fawkes becomes a cardboard shorthand for treason, and the more ridiculous the effigy, the easier it is for spectators to feel moral superiority. We laugh at the puppet, we do not laugh at the moral complexities that ushered him into that role. Mockery is a cheap form of absolution, and while the state applauded the bonfires, such efficient civic theater, there were always more subversive uses tucked into the warmth of the crowd. People whispered, sly songs were sung. The crowd's laughter sometimes contained a sting aimed not at the puppet, but at the officials who had manufactured the ritual. A joke, carefully couched in the right rhyme, is harder to punish than a speech. Folklore finds loopholes and uses them. Under the pretense of celebrating law and order, communities could meet and exchange ideas that might once have been whispered only in corners. Religion, predictably, had a field day. Clergy tailored sermons to fit the moral sheen of the bonfire ritual. They turned politics into parables about virtue and vice, converting a complicated set of grievances and misalignments into homilies. Treason is sin, the sermon would say, and sin must be punished. This tidy conversion relieved congregations of the discomfort of analyzing state policy. They could unburden their civic anxieties into a sermon and afterwards return to market, life with a clear conscience. But the pulpit was not the only venue for interpretation. It was merely the loudest. Satire, pamphlets, and songs provided alternative readings. The same press that printed the government's tidy narrative also printed laughing songs that mocked its pomp. Pamphleteers loved contradiction. They printed the official proclamation on one side of a sheet and a bawdy song on the other. Readers folded the paper, read what suited them, and passed it along. In a sense, press culture became a conversation between the state's preferred story and the public's appetite for rumor and ridicule. Those who bought the cheapest sheet of news often read it with a forked tongue. Aloud, the sermon for public ears. Silently, the joke for private enjoyment. Let us not forget the economics of commemoration. Vendors, always quick to monetize a moral holiday, set up stalls selling cheap toys shaped like the effigy, roasted chestnuts, and printed rhymes. The bonfire became an early modern economy, a day when an entire informal market heated up around a civic narrative. For many, the holiday's significance was less political and more practical. It's a day off, a chance to make a little money, and a reason to eat something fried. Rituals survive not only because they mean something, but also because they pay. Memory also leaks through law and custom. The legal system, eager to deter, codified harsh penalties and made examples of the conspirators. But law cannot control every rumor, every joke, every private conversation. Instead, it creates a formal record that sits beside informal memory. Years later, the legal narration of the event, trials, proclamations, formal executions, would be read as evidence that justice was served. But what is recorded in law is often the state's preferred version of events, packaged for legitimacy. The lived reality, the whispered debates in taverns, the petty feuds that push men toward desperate choices, remains stubbornly unrecorded except in margins, scraps, and private letters. And then symbols do what symbols do best. They mutate. Guy Fawkes, once a cautionary figure for obedience, is in later centuries repurposed into something else entirely. Masks inspired by his likeness appear in radical pamphlets and later among groups that want anonymity and protest. It's the historical equivalent of a coat being passed down through generations and rebuttoned to fit new bodies. The original man, with his debts and grudges and very human reasons for entering a cellar with barrels, is forgotten in favor of what later societies needed him to represent. Sometimes treachery, sometimes resistance, sometimes the cheerful anonymity of a protester wearing a smile made of papier-mâché. The press keeps sharpening the symbol into something useful. Caricatures in print stretch Fawkes's features into grotesque shapes that make him easier to hate or to laugh at, depending on your inclination. Political cartoonists, those sharp-eyed, merciless sculptors of public opinion, play with his image until it becomes shorthand for a whole family of anxieties. Failed plots, fear of foreign influence, and the perennial dread of the mob. Visual representations travel faster than text. An image of a masked face across a broadsheet can travel the city quicker than a sermon. Symbols, once freed from their origins, are hard to recapture. Family histories, meanwhile, are less implacable than public rituals. The wives and children of the executed do not fit into neat narratives. They inherit stigma and poverty, yes, but also a private archive of grief and small acts of stubborn survival. Remember that public martyrdom is only one side of a life. The domestic ledger keeps tally of meals missed, of neighbors turned cold, of names whispered with shame. Generations later, descendants might still carry the social interest of a relative's public disgrace. Yet they also keep letters, recipes, and lullabies that refuse to be folded into official versions. These private relics are the slow-burning fuel of real memory. Let us turn to the pamphlets themselves for a moment. Those glossy, ragged pages that did more to shape history than any official edict. Pamphleteers were opportunists and artists alike. They crafted lines that would be read aloud, half-remembered, and repeated. A good line in a pamphlet becomes a hook. It sticks in the mind of a reader the way a splinter stays under skin. Papers printed confessions in small type so that the public could chew on scandal like hard candy. Their business model favored outrage, and outrage keeps people reading. The pamphleteer's talent was less in truth than in traction. Making stories move, art and theater intervened next. Playwrights and stage companies, those masters of public feeling, began to work the narrative into dramas. Tragedy and farce are cousins in the theater. Both attend to human extremities. The Gunpowder plot supplied scenery and motive, a night of secrecy, an act of violence, the subsequent moral reckoning. On stage, the events could be amplified or softened, characters honed into archetypes or given complexities that the printed broadsheet lacked. Theater offered an imaginative playroom where the public could rehearse outrage and sometimes empathy. Fast forward through decades of reworking, and you find that ritual has ossified into custom. The bonfire, the effigy, the rhyme, they become part of a seasonal calendar as sure as planting and harvest. Children learn the verse as if it were the alphabet. Communities, habituated to the story, no longer think much about its political causes. What was once a series of desperate choices becomes a holiday to be celebrated with hot food and loud noise. Habit erases the subtleties that made the event meaningful and turns gravity into a festival. But remember, rituals can be repurposed. Victims of past persecution eventually find new meanings in old practices. What began as a punitive commemoration can be turned into a protest against a different kind of oppression. In more recent centuries, figures wearing masks associated with Guy Fawkes have marched not to celebrate treachery, but to advocate for transparency, to stand anonymous against surveillance, or even to poke fun at institutions that seem to consume themselves. The mask is a tool, and tools change function with each hand that takes them up. History has a sense of the comic. The man arrested with matches and barrels is transmuted into a smiling mask, worn by activists who probably know very little about the man's specific motives. This reappropriation is both a rebellion against official memory and a simplification of complex human acts into a usable emblem. It removes the mess and the irony and gives protesters an instantly legible image that says, roughly, "We are anonymous and we are unresolved." At this point in the story, you might wonder, does this cycle always end in appropriation? Often, yes. Old horrors become modern toys. Old villains become icons for causes their original selves would likely have found baffling. And that is part of history's inexorable comic cruelty. The past is never allowed to be sincere for long. It must be repackaged to fit new narratives, and sometimes its edges are sanded down so completely that the original contours are unrecognizable. So here's a small test to drag you into this mess. In the comments, tell me which historical repackaging annoys you the most. When a figure of genuine moral ambiguity is turned into a one-dimensional icon, or when a tragic event is turned into a celebratory holiday without context. I read these, and your answers tell me whether you preferred your history tidy or gloriously complicated, because the truth beneath all this repurposing is stubborn. Human beings rarely act solely from pure malice or pure heroism. They are messy, contradictory, and capable of both petty shame and genuine courage. The Gunpowder plotters were not transcendently evil. They were desperate, theatrical, and tragically miscalculated. The state that punished them was not purely righteous. It was theatrical and concerned with its image. Communities that celebrated or mocked the aftermath were not wholly complicit. They were people trying to make sense of danger and to feel safe again. The afterlife of the plot teaches something more profound than any propagandistic rhyme could. Memory is alive. It eats and is eaten. It is made of jokes, of official proclamations, of kitchen table conversations, of the clack of a printer's press, and of the quiet letters some families never allow to be published. If you want to understand a historical event, do not only look at the scaffold and the official record. Look at the margins, the songs, the jokes told at the edge of bonfires, and the items sold by vendors who turned civic trauma into commerce. Those small things tell you how people actually lived with what the powerful tried to teach them. And before we move on to the final part, where we will stitch together the long-term legacies, legal, cultural, and symbolic, and examine how a single failed night has echoes that reach into obscenely modern arenas, like online anonymity and protest. Culture, let me pin one reminder to the sleeve of your attention. History is less a monument and more a theater of objects. It is made of the items we leave behind and the stories we tell around them. If you could preserve one thing from that night, a pamphlet, an effigy, a confession, or a child's rhyme, which would you choose and why? Drop it in the comments. I want to see whether you keep the scandal, the artifact, or the song. And so we come to the long, slow aftershock, the part of history that refuses the glamour of a single night and insists instead on decades of polishing, repurposing, and accidental comedy. The Gunpowder plot did not end with a scaffold, a proclamation, or a bonfire. It took residence in court records, in children's rhymes, in printers' stalls, in the fabric of a society that learned to fold catastrophe into calendar. The final act is not an execution, but 1,000 tiny edits, statute books rewritten, traditions invented, images redrawn, and above all, ordinary people trying to live on when the state insists on making their grief public property. Let's start with law, that slow bureaucrat that loves to make sure you remember what you did wrong. After the plot, the state did not merely execute men, it rewired the legal language around treason. Definitions tightened, punishments codified, and ceremonial cruelty became a precedent. The law wanted clarity, a crisp category called treason you could point at and say, that one. It liked to be able to place the blame on a neat ceremonial table and then serve it up for public consumption. What the lawyers craved was a moral geometry in which deviation had a name, a sentence, and a public reading. And because law is an engine of memory, future rulers could reach back into that particular night and rummage through its lexicon whenever they feared conspiracies or needed to justify a crackdown. The legal aftertaste of the plot lingered for generations, a precedent that the state could use to define and then discipline dissidents. But laws are only as effective as the people who enforce and interpret them. Judges and magistrates love to repeat the story as a cautionary tale. Prosecutors found it a convenient script to terrify juries. Clerks put it into marginalia that would be cited later as if the past had been unanimous. And while legal mechanisms aim at deterrence, they also create martyrs when applied clumsily. A harsh law can produce a sympathetic story. Human sympathy is an unruly thing. It does not always side with order. Sometimes it sides with the person whose ruin looks like overkill. The more the law dramatized punishment, the more it risked turning the punished into symbols of resilience rather than warnings. Culture does its work differently, faster, smellier, and much more interested in snacks. The bonfires, the effigies, the songs, these were not empty rituals. They were the oxygen of memory. People gathered not only to practice loyalty to the crown, but to eat, to joke, to make a living. Vendors sold puppets and rhymes, and children learned a mnemonic that wired the year's calendar to a civic lesson. This civic theater had an economy. It paid bakers, entertainers, and those who made a living off the commemoration. Culture, dangerously, is practical. Rituals propagate because they fit human schedules and appetites. The domestic economy of memory is why customs survive even when their causes become hazy. Symbols, however, are the troublemakers. Give a symbol enough time and it will grow out of any moral clothing originally stitched onto it. The face associated with the plot, the man who was caught with matches and barrels, mutates across centuries. Cartoons turn his features into a grin or a sneer, depending on the cartoonist's appetite. Masks modeled on his visage become something entirely different. A tool for anonymity, a prop for satire, a banner for protest. In other words, the state's attempt to fix a symbol into shame is undone by the public's imaginative thrift. People will reuse the props of memory for their own scenes. Think of a mask that started as a way to identify shame and ended up being a technique for protest. What was once an emblem of condemnation becomes a hoodie for dissenters. The irony is juicy. The face that was supposed to teach obedience becomes a uniform for those who refuse to be named. The state that willed the punishment could hardly anticipate its own branding, being repurposed as a marketing tool for anonymity and resistance. Symbols are lazy things in the best sense. They get reused because they are cheap to send, easy to recognize, and satisfyingly theatrical. Over time, the mask's meaning fractures into multiple things: a joke, a threat, a selfie, a slogan. But we should not be seduced by the mask's later celebrity and forget the people who paid the price on the ground. Families of the accused endured the most mundane cruelties: eviction, whispers at thresholds, shunned invitations. Social death can be worse than the physical kind. It gnaws at the ability to trade, to marry, to be accepted in neighborhood life. The state's violent spectacle is a public performance. The social aftershock is an intimate, ongoing punishment. To live in the shadow of treason is to have your life narrated by other people's fear. Children carry the echoes of their fathers' names like unpaid debts. And there is the press. The press, that noisy cathedral of rumor and satire. Printers became the new impresarios, deciding what the public would remember. For a small price, they supplied the public with a digestible narrative: the who, the how, and the moral. But the press was also mercilessly opportunistic. A good scandal sold better than a careful analysis. Pamphlets turned trials into theater. Broadsheets turned confessions into catechisms for popular outrage. The press amplified and then simplified, turning ambiguity into slogans. As with all technologies of memory, the printing press influences not just what we remember, but how we remember. Theater and art, meanwhile, took the plot and did something more interesting. They played with it. Playwrights staged versions that turned the conspirators into tragic heroes or comic bunglers according to the taste of the evening and the authorities' tolerance. Theater provided an imaginative sandbox where audiences could rehearse their feelings about treason without actually committing it. The stage is a peculiar moral workshop. Fictionalized horrors can teach, amuse, and anesthetize all at once. In that public playhouse, the plot acquired psychological depth that the pamphlets often refused to provide. Century by century, people did strange things with the story. They made it a rhyme for children, a sermon for the faithful, a cartoon for the satirical, and a banner for the revolutionary. They cooked it into pies, sold it on the high street, and tossed it onto fire pits with a kind of civic glee. The story's versatility is a sign of its power. Anything that enters everyday life will be recoded and reused. The past is not static. It is a buffet table from which successive generations plate what they need. Fast forward to the modern world and you find the plot's face in digital guise. Online anonymity borrows the mask's theatrical logic. A digital avatar, like a papier-mâché mask, makes a public claim while shielding private identity. Protest movements borrow the visual shorthand and the rhetorical edge of a historical symbol and reapply it against surveillance, corruption, or censorship. The riff is deliciously modern. An icon born from a failed plot to destroy a building becomes a favored emblem for online campaigns that aim to dismantle different kinds of power. Banks, corporations, governments, with tweets, memes, and coordinated action. The continuity is not literal, but it is thematic. Both the 17th century plotters and the 21st century activists were trying to change systems, though their methods, ethics, and contexts are wildly different. This is where moral ambiguity blooms. Are modern users of the mask celebrating violence? Rarely. Most use it to signify anonymity and resistance, not literal explosions. But symbols are porous. They bleed ideas. When a mask stands with a hashtag, it inherits 1,000 different intentions and contradictions. The state that once chalked treason on a man's chest now worries about a meme's ability to mobilize. The tools have changed, but the essential anxiety, power's fear of coordinated, concealed action, remains. That continuity is worth meditating on. Fear, repression, and theatrical signification are stubbornly recurrent players in human governance. Yet, let us not allow the symbolism to swallow the nuance. Real people made real choices for reasons that are often petty, sometimes noble, and frequently mixed. The conspirators were not archetypes. They were people in debt, in fear, in love with dramatic remedies that promised catharsis. The state was not merely righteous. It sought image and order. Communities were not monolithically obedient. They were markets of rumor, pity, and pragmatic commerce. Memory is the cumulative result of all of these messy actors. So what do we take away from the long tale of the plot? The laws that outlasted kings, the rituals that outlived understanding, the symbols that were repurposed into radical anonymity. Maybe this, that history is a living, argumentative thing. It is a place of negotiations between power and populations, between law and rumor, between image and fact. The past is contested not only by historians and libraries, but by street vendors, cartoonists, parents teaching rhymes, and activists choosing icons. If you want to see who controls a society's memory, watch who profits from its rituals, who gets to print the pamphlets, and who decides which faces belong on masks. Before we wrap this up with a last sticky moral or tidy lesson, and you know I'll try to avoid moralizing, ask yourself this: if you had to choose one artifact from that whole messy cascade to preserve for posterity, what would it be? A torn pamphlet, dog-eared and sticky with grease? The mock effigy with its ridiculous grin? The legal parchment that defines treason? Or a photograph, if photos had existed then, of a child at a bonfire, mouth full of sweets and eyes full of that confusing, delicious fear? Drop a comment telling me what you'd save and why. I read them, and those answers tell me how you want history to be spoken of. As lesson, as laughter, as caution, or as messy human experience. In the end, the most absurd truth might be that the plot did not fail so completely after all. It failed in its immediate objective. It did not blow up the Parliament on that particular morning, but it succeeded spectacularly as a narrative seed. It grew into law, custom, joke, symbol, and market. That is not a consolation prize, it's a warning and a marvel. Events that touch the state become templates. The state's reaction becomes part of the story, sometimes louder than the original act. The scaffold, the proclamation, and the pamphlet are as much a part of the history as the barrels themselves. And so, the lesson, however bitter and absurd, is this: when you see a public ritual, a chant, a mask, or a law, remember there were people under that spectacle. There were families weeping in kitchens, printers counting coins, children reciting rhymes without understanding, and a state trying to look decisive. Memory is not a single voice, but a crowd. Pay attention to the sidelines, the vendors, the cartoonists, and the whispers. Those margins are where history's real conversation happens. Lastly, if this has made you uncomfortable, good. If it made you laugh, also good. The ability to hold both reactions is, historically speaking, a survival skill. Drop a comment. Where are you watching from? What artifact would you preserve? And which part of this absurd afterlife fascinates or infuriates you most? I read everything, and your answers shape the next conversation. So, you think you've had a bad day? Spilled your coffee? Got a parking ticket? Cute. How about being 19, declared a heretic, and finding yourself the main event at a medieval barbecue where you're the one on the menu? Welcome to the absolutely not fabulous final moments of Joan of Arc, the teenager who led an army and ended up as kindling. If you think history is all chivalry and glamorous kings, you've come to the wrong place. Stick around, because this is the story of how to get cancelled 15th century style. It's a tale of politics, piety, and the kind of public execution that really ruins your complexion. The year is 1431. The place is Rouen, a gloomy, perpetually damp corner of English-occupied France. And the mood is, well, let's just say festive, if your idea of a good time involves watching a teenage girl get burned alive. Our protagonist, Joan, had a pretty wild career trajectory. Farm girl to national hero 2, now prisoner number 1. It's the kind of glow-up that ends in a literal blaze of glory, though probably not the kind she had in mind. For months she'd been locked away, interrogated by a tribunal of anemic-looking clergymen who seemed personally offended by her audacity to, hear the voice of God without getting their permission first. Imagine the scene: a room full of old men with fancy hats, grilling a teenager about her divine revelations. The theological equivalent of new phone, who dis, but with significantly more damnation involved. Her trial was a masterclass in bureaucratic absurdity. They asked her questions like, does God hate the English? Which is a real no-win situation. Say yes, and you're a blaspheming nationalist. Say no, and you're undermining the entire holy mission you claim to be on. She was smarter than they gave her credit for, often outwitting these learned theologians with simple, direct answers. But let's be honest, the verdict was decided before the first question was even asked. This wasn't a trial, it was a public relations campaign. The English needed to discredit her, to turn the symbol of French resistance into a common witch, a heretic, a fraud. It was less about justice and more about celestial damage control. They couldn't just kill her, they had to assassinate her character first. A much messier but far more effective strategy. So after months of this theological hazing, the day finally arrives, May 30th. The air in Rouen is thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, mud, and what can only be described as morbid anticipation. The town square, the Vieux Marché, has been prepped for the big show. A massive pyre has been constructed, a towering monument to institutional cruelty. It's not just a pile of wood, it's a statement. This is what happens when you challenge the status quo. This is what happens when you're a woman with a sword, in a mission in a world run by men with Bibles and gavels. Joan is woken up early. No gentle alarm clock, just the grating sound of a key in a rusty lock and the grim face of a guard. She's told this is it, the end of the line. She is to be handed over to the secular authorities, a neat little loophole that allows the church to condemn someone to death without technically getting their own hands dirty. We find you guilty of heresy, they say, but we're not going to kill you. These guys with the torches and the pitchforks over here, that's their department. Our hands are clean. It's the ultimate I'm not touching you game, played with a person's life. She's allowed one last confession, one final communion. The priest assigned to her, a man named Martin Ladvenu, seems genuinely distressed. He's one of the few who has shown her a sliver of kindness. As she kneels, you have to wonder what's going through her head. Is she terrified? Is she resolute? Is she thinking about the fields of Domremy, her childhood home, a place so far removed from this stone and wood nightmare? The historical record, written by the very men who condemned her, paints a picture of a weeping, penitent girl. But then they would say that, wouldn't they? It fits their narrative much better. A broken girl is much less threatening than a defiant martyr. Dressed in a simple white shift, the traditional garment of the condemned heretic, she is led out of her cell. The streets are packed. It's like the Super Bowl of public executions. People have come from all over. Merchants have closed their shops. Parents have hoisted their children onto their shoulders for a better view. It's a day out for the whole family. What a time to be alive. Or, not. The crowd is a mix of faces. Some are angry English soldiers spitting curses. Some are French sympathizers, weeping silently, their faces a mask of helpless grief. And most are just there. The curious, the bored, the ones who just wanted to see something, anything happen. The medieval equivalent of doom scrolling, but in real life, with real smoke. She's placed in a cart, the same kind used to haul manure. The irony is probably lost on everyone but her. The journey to the marketplace is slow, a parade of shame. The guards flank her, their faces impassive. The priests are chanting, the crowd is murmuring, a low, buzzing sound that's more unnerving than a full-throated roar. Through it all, Joan is said to have been praying, her eyes fixed on a makeshift cross held up for her by a sympathetic English soldier. Even in the sea of hostility, small pockets of humanity existed, a reminder that history is never just black and white, but a messy, complicated shade of gray. As they reach the Vieux Marché, the pyre comes into full view. It's even bigger up close, a crude, towering structure of plaster and wood, designed for maximum visibility and a slow, agonizing burn. This wasn't about a quick end. This was theater. It was designed to be a spectacle of suffering, a warning etched into the memory of everyone who witnessed it. At the top, a stake, and a sign detailing her crimes. Heretic, relapser, apostate, idolater. They really threw the whole thesaurus at her. It's amazing they didn't charge her for this sign. She is pulled from the cart and led towards the platform. Her legs must have felt like lead, every step a countdown. The Bishop of Beauvais, Pierre Cochon, the architect of her downfall, is there, ready to deliver his final self-righteous sermon. He's a man who has staked his entire career on this conviction. For him, this is a triumph. He preaches to the crowd, his voice full of pious conviction, explaining why this is all necessary, why this girl, this teenager, is a threat to Christendom itself. It's a long, boring speech, the kind of speech that makes you wish the fire would start sooner, just to make it stop. Joan stands there, forced to listen to her own condemnation, a final act of psychological torture. The crowd grows restless. They came for a burning, not a lecture. Finally, Cochon wraps it up. The sentence is formally read out. The church officially abandons her to the secular arm. A legal fiction, but a deadly one. The bailiff of Rouen, a man named Jean Massieu, who had been her reluctant usher throughout the trial, takes her by the arm. His job is to lead her up the pyre. He would later testify that she was weeping, begging for forgiveness, not from God, but from the people of France, for failing them. She asked for a cross. An English soldier, moved by her plea, hastily fashioned a small cross from 2 broken pieces of a stick and gives it to her. She kisses it and places it inside her dress, next to her heart. It's a small, desperate gesture of faith in a world that has shown her none. She then begs Massieu to have the church bring a proper crucifix from a nearby chapel so she can see it as she dies. Her final request, a focal point for her faith as the world dissolves into fire and pain. The request is granted, a priest is dispatched. She climbs the steps of the pyre. The executioner, a man named Geoffroy Thirage, is waiting. This is his job. He's probably burned dozens of people. To him, this is just another day at the office. He binds her to the stake with thick ropes. She is high above the crowd now, visible to everyone, the lone figure in white against a backdrop of dark wood. The priest returns with the crucifix and holds it up high. Joan keeps her eyes locked on it. It's the only thing she wants to see. The executioner descends carrying a lit torch. The moment has arrived. The crowd falls silent. A collective intake of breath. This is it, the climax of the show. He touches the torch to the kindling at the base of the pyre. It catches immediately. A small lick of flame, then another and another. The smoke begins to rise, thin and wispy at first, then thicker, blacker. It curls around her feet, then her legs. The heat must be unbearable. The smell of burning pitch and wood fills the air, soon to be joined by a much more gruesome scent. What do you think was her final, most prominent thought? Was it betrayal? Fear? Or was it a serene belief that she was heading towards her God? Let me know in the comments what you think goes through the mind of a saint at the moment of her fiery end. The flames leap higher, greedily consuming the wood. They are orange and red and terrifyingly alive. The crowd is a blur of faces, a wall of silent witnesses. The smoke is choking now, a thick, black cloud enveloping the stake. For a moment, she is lost to view, a silhouette in the inferno. And then, through the roar of the fire and the crackling of wood, a voice is heard. A single word screamed out with the last of her breath. A name that had been her guide, her inspiration, and her doom. Oh, Jesus! It's a cry of faith, a cry of agony, a cry that cuts through the noise and pierces the heart of everyone present. It is repeated again and again until it is finally choked off by the smoke and the flames. The head of the 19-year-old girl who led an army slumps forward. The Maid of Orleans is dead, but the story, my friends, is far from over. Because what happens after you burn a saint is often more interesting than the burning itself. So the fire roars, and the girl is dead. End of story, right? Roll credits, go home, try to forget the smell of cooked flesh, and hope it doesn't put you off your dinner. But, oh no, my friends, this is the 15th century. When it comes to public displays of power, there's no such thing as overkill. Killing Joan was just the opening act. The main event was what came next. The systematic, bureaucratic, and utterly paranoid process of making sure she stayed dead, not just in body, but in memory. This wasn't just an execution, it was an exercise in erasure. And like most attempts to delete something important, it was a spectacular failure. For the English and their Burgundian allies who ran the show, Joan's death presented a serious PR problem. The whole point of the trial and execution was to prove she was a fraud, a witch sent by the devil, not a saint sent by God. But the thing about burning people at the stake is that it looks, well, an awful lot like martyrdom. The optics are terrible. People see a young girl praying to Jesus as she's engulfed in flames, and they don't think, ah, justice is served. They think, hold on, wasn't that what happened to all those other saints we hear about in church? The last thing the English needed was for rumors to start spreading. Rumors that she had miraculously survived, that an angel had swooped down and carried her away in the smoke, that her soul had been seen ascending to heaven in the form of a white dove. In an age without Twitter, rumors were the original viral content, and they were impossible to control, so they had to manage the narrative. The commander on the scene, the Earl of Warwick, a man not known for his sentimental nature, looked at the roaring pyre and knew his job wasn't done. The crowd was still there, a captivated, horrified audience. They needed to see proof, not just proof of death, but proof of humanity. Proof that this was the body of a mortal woman, not some divine entity who could just shrug off a bit of fire. Enter Geoffroy Therage, the executioner. His business was death, and business was good. But today's task required a little extra, customer service. As the main force of the flames began to die down, leaving a smoldering, glowing heart of embers, he was given his next set of instructions. He had to perform a post-mortem for a live audience. With a long iron hook, he began to rake the fire apart. It was a hellish task. The heat was still intense enough to peel skin from bone. The smoke was acrid and thick, and in the center of it all was what was left of Joan. The records are grimly specific about this part. They had to pull back the embers to display her charred corpse to the assembled crowd. They wanted everyone, from the lowest peasant to the highest nobleman, to see her, to see that she was naked, to see that she was unmistakably female, to see the grotesque reality of what fire does to a human body. This wasn't about decency, it was about certainty. It was a brutal public autopsy designed to quash any lingering doubts. See? The act screamed. No miracle here. Just a dead girl. A very, very dead girl. Now, are we all clear on that? Good. One can only imagine the stunned silence of the crowd, forced to witness this ultimate violation. They had come for a spectacle, and they were getting one, far more intimate and horrifying than they had bargained for. This was the medieval equivalent of a deepfake takedown video, only the content was horrifyingly real. But even that wasn't enough. The English were playing the long game. They understood the power of symbols, the currency of relics. In the Middle Ages, the mortal remains of a saint were priceless. A finger bone, a lock of hair, a scrap of clothing. These were not just souvenirs, they were conduits of divine power. They could heal the sick, protect cities, and inspire armies. The body of a true saint was a spiritual nuclear weapon, and the English, having just executed a girl who many French people already considered a saint, were terrified of leaving a single piece of her behind. They couldn't risk some enterprising French sympathizer sneaking into the ashes, grabbing a charred kneecap and declaring it the holy relic of St. Joan the Barbecued. That kneecap could finance a whole new war. So, once the public viewing was complete, Therage was ordered to get the fire going again. This was the second burning. The first fire was to kill her, the second was to annihilate her. He stoked the embers, threw on more wood, more sulfur, more pitch. He had to create a furnace so hot that it would reduce bone to fine ash. It was a level of methodical destruction that speaks volumes about their fear. They weren't just killing a person anymore. They were trying to kill an idea. They were trying to unwrite her from the book of the world, to turn her body into nothing more than anonymous dust, indistinguishable from the ash of the wood that consumed it. And here, in this second, more desperate burning, the story takes another bizarre, almost defiant turn. According to several accounts, including that of the executioner himself, there was one part of her that refused to burn. Her heart. After the second fire had burned itself out, and Therage went to sift through the ashes, he found it. Her heart, along with some other internal organs reportedly intact and full of blood, stubbornly uncharred. The man who made a living from fire was stumped. He tried again. He threw the heart back into the hottest part of the embers, added more flammable material, and blasted it with heat. Still, it would not be consumed. What do we make of this? For the faithful, it was the final miracle, a sign from God that her love for her country, her purity of heart, was so strong that not even the flames of her enemies could destroy it. It was the ultimate posthumous victory, a final, divine "I told you so." For the more scientifically minded, there might be other explanations. Perhaps a medical condition, or the specific way the fire burned, or the chemical reactions of the sulfur and pitch somehow preserving the organ. But honestly, who cares about the science? The legend is so much better. It was the perfect final act of absurdity in this whole tragic farce. The English set out to prove she wasn't a miracle worker, and they ended up creating a story about her indestructible, fireproof heart. You just can't make this stuff up. The universe clearly has a dark sense of humor. This presented a final baffling problem for the authorities. What do you do with a holy relic that you can't destroy? Thérage, by now thoroughly freaked out and reportedly convinced he had damned his own soul, didn't know what to do. The officials, desperate to finish the job, gave him one last order: get rid of everything, all of it. The ashes, the embers, the unburnable heart, every last speck. So he carefully gathered all the remains from the pyre, every grain of ash that had once been Joan of Arc. He sealed them in a heavy sack. His final duty was to walk from the old market square to the river Seine. He was followed by a procession of guards, making sure he completed his task. They took him to a bridge, the Pont Mathilde, and there, under the grey Rouen sky, Geoffroy Thérage, the executioner, tipped the sack over the edge and emptied its contents into the cold, flowing water. The ashes hit the surface, swirled for a moment in a dark cloud, and then were carried away by the current, down towards the English Channel and out into the vast, indifferent ocean. The act was complete. Joan of Arc was gone, erased. Every physical trace of her existence had been utterly obliterated and scattered. They had done it. They had won, or so they thought. The executioner went home and confessed to his priest, weeping that he feared God would never forgive him for burning a holy woman. The English commanders congratulated themselves on a job well done, on snuffing out a dangerous rebellion. But all they had really done was ensure her immortality. They had tried to bury her story under a mountain of ash, but they had only made it grow stronger. They tried to wash her memory away in a river, but they had only spread it to the sea. You can burn a body, you can scatter the ashes, but you cannot kill a legend. And the legend of Joan of Arc was just getting started. They thought the story ended in that river, but it was really just the beginning of her journey from martyr to icon. The very people who condemned her would soon find themselves on the wrong side of history. But how does a convicted heretic, whose ashes are fish food, get a retrial and eventually become a saint? What do you think is the most crucial element in turning a historical figure into a legend? Their actions in life, the way they died, or the stories told about them afterwards? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. The fight for Joan's legacy was about to begin, and it would be just as bizarre and political as the fight for her life. And so, the ashes of a 19-year-old girl mingled with the muck of the river Seine, and the powers that be breathed a collective sigh of relief. Job done, problem solved, a neat, tidy, and brutally public conclusion. The English had their victory, Bishop Cochon had his promotion, and the world could get back to the regularly scheduled programming of the 100 Years' War. But history, my friends, is a messy, ironic beast, and it was far from finished with Joan of Arc. In fact, by turning her into ash and scattering her to the winds, her enemies had made a catastrophic mistake. They had transformed her from a person into an idea, and you can't burn an idea. In the immediate aftermath, nothing much changed. The war dragged on, people starved, kings schemed. It was business as usual in the grim dark reality of the 15th century. But something had shifted, a seed of resentment had been planted. The story of the execution, intended as a show of English strength and divine justification, started to backfire. The tale that spread through French villages and military camps wasn't of a witch getting her just desserts. It was the story of a pious maiden, betrayed and murdered by a foreign enemy and their corrupt clerical puppets. The public execution became a public relations disaster. They had wanted to create a cautionary tale, but instead they had created a martyr. And martyrs make for fantastic recruitment posters. And what of the man she did it all for? King Charles VII, the man she had dragged, kicking and screaming, to his own coronation in Reims. Where was he during her trial? During her execution? The answer is as simple as it is damning. He was busy, consolidating power, negotiating treaties, doing king stuff. He didn't lift a finger to save her. Not a single rescue attempt, no ransom offer, not even a strongly worded letter. From a purely pragmatic Machiavellian perspective, it was a genius move. Joan was a powerful but dangerously unpredictable asset. She claimed God was talking to her, which is great when she's winning you battles, but it's a nightmare for long-term political stability. Once she was captured, she became a liability. Her trial was an embarrassment, so Charles did what any good medieval manager would do. He cut his losses and pretended it never happened. It was the ultimate act of royal ghosting. Thanks for the crown, see you never. For 20 years, this was the status quo. Joan was a forbidden topic in the French court, a slightly awkward memory everyone agreed not to talk about. Like a disastrous office Christmas party, the war continued, but the tide had turned. The French armies, now better organized and infused with a renewed sense of national purpose, a purpose Joan had largely ignited, began to push the English back. The spirit of the Maid was a more potent force than her physical presence had ever been. By 1449, the French forces were at the gates of Rouen, the very city where she had been burned, when Charles VII made his triumphant entry into the recaptured capital of Normandy. He was suddenly faced with a very awkward piece of historical baggage. He was now the master of the city where his personal champion, the architect of his coronation, had been executed as a devil-worshipping heretic. This wasn't just bad optics, it was a theological and political crisis. How can you claim to be the most Christian king, ruling by the grace of God, when your legitimacy was secured by a witch? The foundation of his reign rested on the work of a condemned criminal. The stain on her name was a stain on his crown. Suddenly, after 2 decades of strategic silence, clearing Joan's name became a top priority. It wasn't about justice for a dead girl, it was about political sanitation for a living king. And so began one of the most remarkable and cynical legal proceedings in history, the nullification trial. If the first trial was a show trial designed to kill her, this was a show trial designed to unkill her reputation. It was a bureaucratic exorcism, a vast, state-sponsored effort to say, "our bad." The man put in charge was the Inquisitor General of France, a theologian named Jean Brehal. His job was to conduct a massive investigation to prove that the original trial, conducted by the Inquisition's own predecessors, was a complete sham. It was the ultimate case of the new management investigating the old management and finding them, shocker, to be completely incompetent and corrupt. Brehal and his team spent years at it, compiling a mountain of paperwork that would make any modern lawyer weep. They were on a mission to find a procedural error, a legal loophole, any technicality they could use to declare the original verdict null and void. They fanned out across France, hunting down anyone who was still alive and had been present at the first trial. And one by one, the ghosts of 1431 were brought forth to testify. It was a parade of men suddenly eager to share their side of the story, now that it was safe to do so. Jean Massieu, the bailiff who had escorted her, testified that the judges had threatened him. Martin Ladvenu, the priest who had heard her last confession, spoke of her piety and fearlessness. The notaries who had recorded the proceedings confessed that the official transcripts had been deliberately falsified, edited to make her look worse. Even Geoffroy Thérage, the executioner, was questioned, and it was his testimony that gave the world the chilling story of her unburnable heart, a tale that sealed his own belief in her sainthood. It's a fascinating and deeply human spectacle. How much of this testimony was genuine, guilt-ridden confession, and how much was simple self-preservation? These men were now subjects of the king who wanted Joan's name cleared. Praising her was the politically smart and safe thing to do. They all pointed the finger at one man, the one person who could no longer defend himself. Pierre Cochon, the Bishop of Beauvais, who had presided over the trial. By now, he was conveniently dead. He became the perfect scapegoat. The narrative was set. This wasn't the fault of the church as an institution. Oh no. It was the fault of one ambitious, corrupt, English-sympathizing bishop who had hijacked the process for political gain. It was a masterful act of passing the buck, a lesson in institutional damage control that is still studied today. The investigators pored over the records of the first trial, picking it apart with legalistic glee. They found error after error. The trial was held in enemy territory, not on neutral ground. The accused was denied a proper legal advocate. She was held in a secular prison guarded by English soldiers, not in a church prison guarded by nuns, which was her right. She was only 19, and they had used complex theological trick questions to trap her. The whole thing, they concluded, was rotten from the start. It was a corruption, a fraud, a calumny, an injustice, and an error. Finally, on July 7th, 1456, 25 years after Joan's death, the final verdict of the nullification trial was delivered in a grand ceremony at the Cathedral of Rouen. Hundreds of people gathered to hear it. A solemn procession marched through the city. Joan's elderly mother, Isabelle Romay, who had fought relentlessly for this day, was there to witness it. The Archbishop of Reims read the final judgment. The original condemnation was declared to be replete with fraud, calumny, wickedness, contradictions, and manifest errors of law and of fact. He ordered that a copy of the original verdict be ceremoniously torn up. Joan of Arc was officially innocent. She was a martyr for her faith and her country. Justice was served, right? Well, yes and no. It was a victory, but a hollow one. A posthumous pardon is a cold comfort. It didn't unburn her. It didn't bring her back. It was a political act first and foremost designed to secure a king's legacy. It cleaned up the historical record, but the smoke from that pyre in the old market square could never truly be washed away. Joan, the woman, was gone, lost to the fire and the river, but in her place something new and far more powerful had been officially sanctioned. Joan, the symbol. Her rehabilitation was complete, but her journey was still not over. It would take another 450 years of politics, war, and societal change to complete her transformation from cleared martyr to Catholic saint. Was the retrial an act of justice, a genuine attempt to right a terrible wrong? Or was it the most cynical political cleanup job in history, a king tidying up his own origin story? Let me know your thoughts down below, because the next chapter in Joan's story is all about how a nation and a church decides who gets to be a saint. So Joan of Arc is officially innocent. Her name is cleared, her conviction torn up, and her mother gets to see her daughter's reputation restored. A happy ending, right? Justice, served cold, but served nonetheless. Time to build the statues and name a few streets after her. But if you think a legal pardon from a French king is the end of the line for Joan's career, you haven't been paying attention. Her journey from here on out becomes, if possible, even more absurd. Getting acquitted was the easy part. The next step on her posthumous resume, sainthood, would involve a 450-year-long application process, making it quite possibly the most drawn-out, politically charged job interview in the history of heaven. For centuries, Joan occupied a strange limbo. She was a national hero, sure, but a complicated one. She was the patriot who saved France, but she did it for a king, and her marching orders came directly from God. This made her awkward for later generations. During the Enlightenment, when reason was the new religion, a girl talking to angels seemed, well, a bit primitive. Then came the French Revolution. The revolutionaries absolutely loved the idea of a peasant girl standing up to foreign oppressors. That part was great, but the fact that she was fighting to install a monarch and was fiercely, devoutly Catholic, that was a PR nightmare. They couldn't exactly put "For God and the King" on their revolutionary banners. So they did what all good propagandists do. They edited her. They rebranded Joan as a proto-revolutionary, a daughter of the common people, conveniently glossing over the whole divine right of kings bit. Her faith became a footnote, her royalism an inconvenient detail. This tug of war over her identity defined her for the next century. She was a ghost being pulled in two opposite directions. Then came the 19th century, a time of fervent nationalism and a major schism in French society. On one side, you had the secular, anti-clerical Third Republic, which saw Joan as the ultimate patriot, a symbol of a unified France, la patrie. They erected statues of her as a warrior, a symbol of the nation's soul, completely independent of the church. On the other side, you had the Catholic Church, which saw the Republic as a godless, secularizing force. They looked at the government co-opting their girl and thought, oh, you think she's your hero? We can do better than that. And so began the great race to claim Joan. It was a holy war fought with bronze and marble. For every secular statue of Joan, the patriot, the government put up in a town square, the church would commission a statue of Joan the pious to be placed in front of a chapel. It was a cold war of iconography. The secularists wanted a Marianne in armor, the church wanted a saint, and the church had the ultimate trump card, canonization. Making her an official, universally recognized saint of the Catholic Church would be the ultimate checkmate. It would forever tie her identity to the faith, snatching her back from the grubby hands of the politicians. The campaign began in earnest in the 1860s, led by the Bishop of Orléans, Félix du Penlu. He launched the official petition to the Vatican, and so the ponderous ancient machinery of the Holy See began to turn. Now, you don't just become a saint. It's not like getting a blue check mark on social media. It's a process, a long, arduous, ridiculously bureaucratic process. There are investigations, tribunals, and a role called the promoter of the faith, more famously known as the devil's advocate. His entire job is to argue against the candidate's sainthood, to pick apart their life, find their flaws, and do everything possible to torpedo their case. Joan of Arc, the girl who was outwitted by legal jargon in 1431, was now going to be put on trial all over again, this time in the celestial courts of Rome. The first step was to declare her venerable in 1894. This basically means the church officially recognizes that she lived a life of heroic virtue. It's the sainthood equivalent of getting a nomination. The evidence was overwhelming. The records from the nullification trial provided a mountain of testimony about her piety, courage, and faith. Even the story of the unburnable heart, once a piece of terrified folklore from an executioner, was now entered into the record as evidence of her special status. But being a good person isn't enough. To move up the ladder to blessed and then to saint, you need proof of divine intervention. You need miracles. This, you might imagine, presents a problem. How do you find verifiable miracles for someone who died over 450 years ago? It's not like you can just go and interview the guy she cured of leprosy in 1429. So the church had to look for posthumous miracles, miracles that happened long after her death, attributed to people praying for her intercession. The call went out. Has anyone prayed to Joan of Arc and been miraculously healed? The church was officially crowdsourcing for wonders, and the wonders came. The case for her beatification, the step before sainthood, rested on three specific medically inexplicable cures. The first was Sister Thérèse of Saint Augustine from Orléans, who in the 1890s was suffering from crippling gastric ulcers. She was on her deathbed, the doctors had given up, and she began a novena, 9 days of prayer, to Joan. On the final day, she was suddenly and completely cured. Doctors examined her and declared it beyond medical explanation. Miracle number 1, logged and verified. The second was Sister Julie Gauthier from Faverolles, who was suffering from a malignant ulcer on her breast. Again, doctors declared the case hopeless. She prayed to Joan, placed a holy image of the maid on her wound, and the ulcer vanished. Miracle number 2, in the bag. The third was Sister Marie Sagnier of Fragia, who was suffering from stomach cancer and peritonitis. She was emaciated, given her last rites, and was expected to die any minute. Her convent began praying to Joan, and she made the full and instantaneous recovery, reportedly getting up and going back to work the next day. The Vatican's medical board reviewed the case files, shrugged their shoulders, and said, "We've got nothing." Miracle number 3. It was a holy hat trick. With 3 verified miracles, the case was sealed. In 1909, Pope Pius X declared her blessed. Joan of Arc was now one step away from the ultimate promotion. The timing was, as always, politically perfect. Tensions between the French government and the Vatican were at an all-time high. Beatifying Joan was a power move, a way for the church to reassert its cultural authority over one of France's most potent national symbols. But the final push for full sainthood came because of something far bigger than French politics, World War I. When Germany invaded France in 1914, Joan of Arc became the ultimate symbol of national resistance. Her image was everywhere. Soldiers carried her picture into battle. Her story was told to inspire a nation facing its darkest hour. She was the farm girl who had kicked out a foreign invader once before. She could inspire them to do it again. She became the godmother of the trenches, a spiritual shield for the nation. After the war, France was victorious, but shattered, having lost an entire generation of its young men. The country needed healing. It needed heroes. It needed saints, and the momentum was unstoppable. The French government, once so hostile to the church's claim on Joan, now saw the political value in having their national hero canonized. It would be a moment of national unity, a way to sanctify the country's sacrifice. The final miracles required for canonization were approved. One was a woman in Lourdes cured of tuberculosis of the foot. Another was a woman in Lisieux cured of cancerous ulcers. The paperwork was complete. The devil's advocate had run out of objections. On May 16, 1920, in a magnificent ceremony at St. Peter's Basilica in Rome, Pope Benedict XV officially declared Joan of Arc a saint. Nearly 500 years after she was burned at the stake as a heretic by a court of the Holy Inquisition, she was now officially raised to the altars of that very same church. Think about the sheer, mind-bending irony of it. The institution that condemned her, killed her, and declared her a limb of Satan, now revered her as a celestial intermediary to God. The journey was complete. Farm girl, general, kingmaker, heretic, ash, political symbol, national hero, and finally, saint. It's a career path nobody could have predicted. Her ashes were in the Seine, but her name was in the litany of saints. The English got her body, but her legacy proved indestructible. Her story is a testament to the absurdity of history, the cynicism of politics, and the incredible power of a narrative. Joan of Arc has become a universal symbol, a blank screen onto which anyone can project their own ideals. Feminist, nationalist, pious mystic, anti-establishment rebel. She is everything to everyone. So the final question is, who is she to you? A tragic victim of a brutal system, a divinely inspired warrior, or the ultimate example of how a good story can conquer armies, kings, and even death itself? Let me know in the comments which Joan of Arc you believe in,